Hotep, how's everybody doing today? Hey, this is Michael Imhotep, founder of the African History Network, host of the African History Network show. I'm a talk show host, researcher, lecturer, and writer. It is Sunday, June 9th, 2019, and we are live. Hope everybody's doing well today. Share this broadcast on your Facebook page. Invite your friends to tune in also. We have a lot to talk about. So I saw articles dealing with this topic going back to March of 2019, an article by history.com, which is the official website of the History Channel. And then I saw one by the New York Times, actually going back to February 2016, first from the New York Times, read the New York Times every day, then one from the following month from history.com, official website of the History Channel. I get their emails on a daily basis. And then also one from AtlantaBlackStar.com, okay? So I wanted to talk about this. New research from an African-American female professor shows that white women made up about 40% of slave owners, about 40% of slave owners. And this is research coming from Professor Stephanie E. Jones-Rogers, who's an associate professor of history at the University of California, Berkeley. And she looked at census data from 1850 to 1860, 1850 to 1860. Now, we know that when we deal with the history of slavery, which lasted basically 246 years in the British colonies, what then becomes the United States, we have different nuances as we go from the 1700s to the 1800s, 1600s, 1700s, and 1800s. So she specifically looked at Census Bureau data from 1850 to 1860. Okay, so this is what we're going to talk about. So everybody share this broadcast on your Facebook page. Invite your friends to tune in also. This is a real history lesson. I will also do a preview of the online course that we have starting up on June 12th, Wednesday, June 12th, Ancient Kemet, the Moors, and the Maafa, Understanding the Transatlantic Slave Trade, what they didn't teach you in school. This would be a 8-week, 16-hour online course that I meet once a week. And we'll deal with thousands of years of history. And this will be live. This will be the first time I've done this course live in 2 years. All right, so let's look at the in African-American business owners, post the name of your business here on the thread of the broadcast. Also, we'll let you know how you can advertise with the African History Network also, okay? All right, so let's look at the article from AtlantaBlackStar.com. AtlantaBlackStar.com has a really good article dealing with this topic. Research by Black female professor reveals startling truth that white women made up 40% of slave owners. Okay, research by Black female professor reveals startling truth that white women made up 40% of slave owners. Okay, and this article is from May 25th, 2019. So it was just a few weeks ago, May 25th, 2019. All right, so in this article, it talks about how a set of data uncovered by University of California, Berkeley professor reveals Southern white women played a heavier role in the enslavement of Africans than previously thought. Professor Stephanie E. Jones-Rogers, an associate professor of history at the university, combed through data from the 1850 and 1860 census and revealed that white women made up around 40% of slave owners, okay? So she has a new book that came out in February 2019, just in time for African American History Month. And the name of her book is They Were Her Property. They Were Her Property, White Women as Slave Owners in the American South. White women as slave owners in the American South, okay? So let me say from the outset that this is because of changes in social media platforms and because of new policies dealing with hate speech, and this is going to be on different social media platforms, this broadcast and the podcast, and it's going to be on 8 different podcast platforms. And because of certain backlash and attacks that have happened to me recently, let me say this from the outset. This is not hate speech. This is not about hating anybody. This is about understanding history and correcting the historical record. There's overwhelming evidence to document what we're talking about, okay? And we're not talking about hating anybody. And, I teach this history, and also I'm an advocate of the history of African Americans being taught in school and the correct history of slavery being taught in school. And you hear me oftentimes talk about this study from the Southern Poverty Law Center called Teaching Hard History of American Slavery. Teaching Hard History of American Slavery. This is a 52-page study from the Southern Poverty Law Center. You can download it. Go to splcenter.org, splcenter.org, and it documents how the history of slavery is being incorrectly taught in American schools, not just schools that have predominantly African-American student body, but American schools, period, okay? It documents how the history is being incorrectly taught, the negative side effects from the history of slavery being incorrectly taught, and it gives tips and teaches how to more correctly teach the history of slavery. Okay, so I want people to understand that some of the information I say may go outside the circumference of some people's awareness. Just because you don't like it or disagree with it or never heard it before does not mean that it's not true. It just means you have to do some research to understand what it is that I'm talking about. All right, so let me say that from the start. Okay, so let's continue here. How's everybody doing? Toya and Daniel, Shirley, Anthony, just a few of the people watching. Okay, we'll post a link here also. You can register for the online course that I have starting up Wednesday, June 12th. And we'll do it live, and then it's archived after that. You can go back and watch it over and over again. We just posted the link also. It's at our website, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. The name of the online course is Ancient Kemet, the Moors, and the Maafa, Understanding the Transatlantic Slave Trade, where they didn't teach in the school, 2019 edition. All right, so let's continue here. All right, so the findings helped Professor Stephanie E. Jones compile her book entitled They Were Her Property, White Women as Slave Owners in the American South. Now, on her department page at the University of California, Berkeley, Professor Stephanie Jones Rogers describes the February 2019 release of her book as, quote, a regional study that draws upon formerly enslaved people's testimony to dramatically reshape current understandings of white women's economic relationships to slavery, end quote. One of the things that her book did, the research of her book, one of the things that it did, and it ties into this 52-page study, Teaching Hard History of American Slavery, is that in addition to looking at census data, and in addition to looking at documents and letters, things like this, what are routinely looked at, she also looked at slave narratives or narratives of former slaves, okay? She looked at interviews done with former slaves in the 1930s from the WPA, Works Progress Administration, okay? And this was part of the New Deal, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, in the 1930s. And it was a specific department there called the Federal Writers Project. Okay, Works Progress Administration, WPA, of the 1930s. And this was part of the Federal Writers Project of the WPA. And one thing that they did was they interviewed former slaves and documented this, okay? If we look at this document, Teaching Hard History of American Slavery, on page, 16, I think it is, they talk page 10. On page 10, they show you this picture of this African-American woman who's a former slave, okay? I downloaded the study, took it to the printer, got it printed up, because this is what I do with a lot of studies. I do a lot of research, so I get the studies and get them printed up. But on page 10 of this study, it talks about how in the 1930s and 40s, the Works Progress Administration and Farm Security Administration photographed the daily lives of thousands of formerly enslaved people, tenant farmers, and sharecroppers. This photograph of a woman born in enslavement was taken in Greensboro, Alabama in 1941. Okay, so this is what we see here. This is from page 10 of this study that you can download as soon as you finish watching this broadcast, and we'll give you the link. We'll post a link here also. This is from Teaching Hard History, American Slavery from the Southern Poverty Law Center. So one thing that she did that went beyond a lot of other research is that she looked at firsthand accounts about slavery from formerly enslaved African people. Okay, so in her book, Professor Stephanie E. Jones Rogers explained that white women's involvement in slavery comes from family as their slave-owning parents, quote, typically gave their daughters more enslaved people than land, end quote, okay? Slave-owning parents typically gave their daughters more enslaved people than land. Now, she said, quote, what this means is that their very identities as white Southern women are tied to the actual or the possible ownership of people. She said in an interview with History.com, was the official website of the History Channel. History.com has an article dealing with this from March 12, 2019. So this was probably the second article I saw on this topic. The first one I saw was from February 2019 by the New York Times. The second one was from History.com. I get their emails on a daily basis, then with This Day in History, and then also Inside History or History in the Headlines. I get that email as well. This article from History.com is entitled The Massive Overlooked Role of Female Slave Owners. The Massive Overlooked Role of Female Slave Owners. Okay, yeah, I kind of find it interesting that they didn't say white female slave owners, okay, in the title, but it's all right. I know what you mean. It's okay. When I look at the article from the New York Times, that article is entitled, it's a review of her book. That article is entitled White Women Were Avid Slave Owners, a New Book Shows. White Women Were Avid Slave Owners, a New Book Shows. So the article from History.com, I'm glad they wrote it. It's the History.com, once again, is the official website of the History Channel. But I just find it interesting in the title, they didn't say the overlooked role of white female slave owners, but it's all right. You got the information out there. I guess that's the most important thing, okay? And once again, this is not an attack on white women or anything like this. When I teach this history, I try to be very fair in the history. You had white people who were abolitionists who risked their lives to free enslaved Africans. That is true. That's a true part of the history. White men and white women. You had some that were abolitionists. You had even more who were slave owners. And it's also important to understand that about at least this time in history that she's looking at, 1850, 1860, around this time, 75% of white people don't own slaves. So basically 25% of white people are the slave owners. That's true also. Okay. So when I do these types of presentations and these broadcasts, my lectures, my show, so people understand, maybe some people, this type of information is new to them. This is not a wholesale indictment of white people. This is not an attack on them. This is dealing with the history and correcting the historical record. This is what this is about. All right. Sandra, how you doing? Tommy as well. Okay. How's everybody doing? And then also, I understand, and I've had people, parents who have biracial children who've approached me about getting information to teach their children. I understand that can be complex as well. Okay. If you are a white parent that has a biracial child, or an African-American parent that has a biracial child, how do we teach this history? Right. And at the same time, you don't want that biracial child to feel a certain way about their white parent. Right. That's something that I personally don't have to deal with, but I'm sensitive to other people who have to navigate that. I have them reach out to me for resources as well. OK. Toya said, we're not apologizing for our history. No, we're not apologizing for our history. But when I deal with this type of information, and especially because of certain changes in social media platforms based upon hate speech and certain things that have happened to me recently that I'm not going to go into. I have to frame this in a certain way. Okay, let's continue here. All right, so her book also notes that owning enslaved Africans served as white women's primary source of wealth, plus owning a large number of enslaved people reportedly made women better marriage material. All right. And this dealt with the accumulated wealth that some white women had who were slave owners. This made them a better catch. This made them a more suitable mate for a white man. All right. Now, once wed, okay, once she was married, white women were said to have fought and frequently won the right to continue to have ownership over their enslaved Africans, not handing over ownership to their husbands, right? Professor Jones Rogers says, quote, for them, slavery was their freedom, end quote. For them, slavery was their freedom. One example she gives is somebody who we know, who we've heard at least about, some of us know more about it than others, is Martha Washington, George Washington's wife. Martha Washington was a slave owner when they got married, and she owned more slaves than George Washington did. So after Martha Washington married President George Washington in Virginia in 1759, George Washington is said to have possibly owned around 18 people. Now, he became a slave owner at about 10 or 11 years old. He inherited some slaves from his father, all right? But his wife, one of the richest women in the state of Virginia, owned 84 enslaved Africans and dramatically increased the local slave population. So when they married, she owned 84 enslaved Africans. So she inherited basically her slaves, okay? And there was a story, there was a case about one of George Washington's runaway slaves. Her name was Ona Judge. I've talked about her in the past. AtlantaBlackStar.com and other sources have articles about Ona Judge, ONA JUDGE. And there's a good book called Never Caught, written by an African-American female historian who I met and talked to, and I can't remember her name. I'll pick it up. It wasn't Dr. Armstrong, Dr. Erica Armstrong Dunbar. That's who it is. Because I met the sister. She spoke at the Charles H. Wright Museum of African-American History. And I met the sister. I talked to her. We had a really good conversation. And I told her I was familiar with her work. And she also, let's see here. I'm going to try to pull up the article. That's a fascinating history dealing with Ona Judge. Ona Judge was the personal attendant to personal slave of Martha Washington. Ona Judge found out that Martha was going to give her away as a wedding gift to Martha Washington's niece or something like that, female relative niece or something like that. So Ona Judge found out about this and she ran away. She goes up north. She runs away, and George Washington sent slave catchers after her a number of times, but she was never caught. This is where the title of the story, the title of the book comes from, Never Caught. All right. So, when oftentimes we talk about George Washington, we talk about the American Revolutionary War. We talk about him being one of the founding fathers, but his involvement in slavery and the enslavement of African people and the dehumanization of African people is oftentimes not talked about, okay? So when we deal with this, history, it's a nuanced, complex history. He was, Dr. John Henrik Clarke probably put it the best. One of our great Grandmaster Scholar warriors, Dr. Clarke said, don't take George Washington out of the history, leave him in there, but you have to put Washington in the proper historical context, okay? The proper historical context. So the name of the book is called Never Caught, The Washingtons' Relentless Pursuit of Their Runaway Slave Ona Judge. Never Caught, The Washingtons' Relentless Pursuit of Their Runaway Slave Ona Judge, by Dr. Erica Armstrong Dunbar. Okay, and this article right here is from AtlantaBlackStar.com. I think that's when I first found out about her. This article is from February 11th, 2017. And let me see, it was either there. Now, Roland Martin also interviewed her on TV1 when he had a show on TV1, News One Now. So I saw her there. And she also, let me see, if the Nat Turner movie came out in 2016, I first found out about her in the book that Nate Parker put out. That was a companion to the Nat Turner movie, Birth of a Nation. He put out a book about that also. So I have the book somewhere here with all these books here. And that sister wrote co-wrote a chapter in the book that deals with the history of the Nat Turner Rebellion. So let me see if I have the book here, because I have about 4 stacks of books here. So hold on, let me see. Just give me a second here, see if I can pull it out. This looks like Jenga. This is like African-centered Jenga or something. I'm trying to pull out the book that's towards the bottom of the stack without the whole stack falling. Let me see if I can find it. Oh, here we go. All right, here we go. So this book right here, if you saw the Nate Parker movie, Birth of a Nation, about the Nat Turner Rebellion, so I got this October 2016. So I probably first found out about her possibly from this book, because she co-wrote, Dr. Erica Armstrong Dunbar, she co-wrote the chapter in here dealing with history. And it gives a lot of background historical information about the Nat Turner Rebellion that's probably hard to find. So the chapter she co-wrote it with another fantastic African-American female historian named Dr. Danny Ramey Berry. And okay. The chapter they wrote is called A History of Resistance, the Unbroken Chain of Enslaved African Resistance and Rebellion. A History of Resistance, the Unbroken Chain of Enslaved African Resistance and Rebellion. So if you get this book, or if you have it, it starts on page 35, okay? And they deal with a lot of the background history. And history I didn't know about the Nat Turner Rebellion. So when I did my lecture dealing with the history of the Nat Turner Rebellion of 1831, when the movie came out, there was some historical inaccuracies in the movie. The real history is different. So this was one of my sources for my lecture, dealing with the real history of the Nat Turner Rebellion and separating the movie, separating what we saw in the movie from the actual history. Okay, the name of this book is called The Birth of a Nation, Nat Turner and the Making of a Movement, edited by Nate Parker, the official movie tie-in. Okay, that's the name of this book. A lot of people don't even know this book exists. They went to go see the movie, don't even know this book exists. Okay, The Birth of a Nation, Nat Turner and the Making of a Movement, edited by Nate Parker, the official movie tie-in. So this is a crucial book. If you saw the movie, this is a crucial book. It also deals with behind the scenes, and it deals with the history of the making of the movie and what Nate Parker had to go through to get that movie made also. All right, so let's continue here. How's everybody doing? All right, and then we'll post a link here for the online course that starts up, that I'm teaching, that starts up Wednesday, June 9th. It's an 8-week, 16-hour online course, Ancient Kemet, the Moors, and the Maafa, Understanding the Transatlantic Slave Trade, what they didn't teach you in school, 2019 edition. We're going to deal with thousands of years of history. It's going to be deep. All right, so let's go back to the article from AtlantaBlackStar.com. Research by Black female professor reveals startling truth that white women made up 40% of slave owners. All right. So when we're talking about Martha Washington, and we start talking about Ona Judge. All right. Professor Stephanie E. Jones Rogers argues that white women were trained to be engaged in the slavery industry at a young age. She said, quote, their exposure to the slave market is not something that begins in adulthood. It begins in their homes when they're little girls, sometimes infants, when they're given enslaved people as gifts. And this happened, okay? And when we look at Nat Turner had 3 owners in his lifetime. Now, he died, he was executed November 11th, 1831. Okay, he was 31 years old. One of his slave owners was about 10 years old. It was a white boy about 10 years old who basically inherited Nat Turner. Okay, so you see this taking place in history. All right, so Professor Jones-Rogers demonstrates that in her book. She demonstrates that in her book by including interviews with formerly enslaved people conducted in the 1930s through the New Deal Agency Works Progress Administration, all right? The WPA, Works Progress Administration, and that was the Federal Writers Project, which was like a department in the Works Progress Administration. One formerly enslaved said children would ruthlessly beat enslaved people. She said, quote, it didn't matter the child was large or small. They always beat you till the blood ran down. Or they always beat you till the blood ran down, she said. And let me see. I saw that quote. If we look at the article from history.com, they have that quote in here as well. It didn't matter whether the child was large or small. One woman told the WPA they always beat you till the blood ran down. I think they went deeper into this in the article from the New York Times. Okay, on page 2 of the article from the New York Times entitled White Women Were Avid Slave Owners, a New Book Shows, from February 26, 2019, written by Parul Sehgal, Sehgal. On page 2 of this article, it says, from these stories, Jones-Rogers, let me see, we have it here. I have it pulled up here on the screen also. So let's scroll down to this. From these stories, Jones-Rogers brings an unseen world to life of white women's instruction in domination, a process of grooming that began in infancy. WPA interviewees, Works Progress Administration interviewees, recount threats, abuse, and whippings administered by white children. Quote, it didn't matter whether the child was large or small, one woman said. They always beat you till the blood ran down. And this also ties into, now at the same time, at this point, I understand that all white people at this point in time did not own slaves. That is true, okay? But when we talk about racism being a system of advantage and privilege distributed based upon race, because racism has nothing to do with not liking people, calling people racial epithets, things like this, right? And if you read Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome by Dr. Joy DeGruy, she talks about this as well. If you read Powernomics by Dr. Claude Anderson, one of my teachers, or his first book, Black Labor, White Wealth, he deals with this as well. If you read some of my articles that I've written, I talk about this and deal with this in my lectures. Racism is a system of advantage and privilege distributed based upon race. Racism comes out of the ideology of European white supremacy, and this is designed to preserve white survival. Okay, this is a system. Racism occurs when one race of people control the majority of the wealth, power, and resources, benefits, privileges, land, access to education, access to opportunity, and they use this to marginalize, subordinate, and do harm to another race of people. Okay, now I'm not saying all white people are white supremacists, that all white people subscribe to this ideology, but we see it throughout history for the last 500 years. And what happens is when we talk about what was one of the most important things to understand about this is when we talk about racism being a system of advantage and privilege, then we have to ask ourselves, what is a system? Okay, a system is not a computer program. All right. When we talk about the system, right, we talk about the system is holding us down. A system is a group of people who have been indoctrinated with a certain ideology, and they work to keep that ideology, they work to uphold that ideology and enforce that ideology. That's what a system is. When we talk about racism being a system of advantage and privilege distributed based upon a race, then what are we actually talking about is the system. We're talking about a group of people who have been indoctrinated by a smaller group of people. We can call it the 1% or the 10%. They've been indoctrinated with a certain ideology, been convinced of it, and they work to uphold that ideology and keep it in place. Okay, so this is what we have to understand. And I do a lot of research. I travel across the country. I do lectures. I read African American sources, white sources, things like this. Americans are woefully ignorant about history. African Americans and white Americans are woefully ignorant about history. The reason why is because there has been a concerted effort not to teach the correct history in our schools. So then those people who graduate from schools, American schools, if they don't get the correct history, they grow up to be adults who have children who are ignorant of history. So for instance, if we look at this study from the Southern Poverty Law Center, all this ties in together. And this is one of, now when I did the last time I did the online course, it was in September 2017. This study didn't exist because this study was first introduced in, was released basically February 2018 for African American History. So this didn't even exist. But one of the things this study did, Teaching Hard History, American Slavery from the Southern Poverty Law Center. One of the things it did was it did a survey of 1,000 high school seniors, 12th graders, 1,000 12th graders from across the country. And it asked them different questions about what they knew about the history of slavery based upon what they were taught in school. It found that only 8% of high school seniors surveyed out of 1,000 could identify slavery as the central cause of the Civil War. Now, these are children in 12th grade. They're learning American history, American government. Some of them may have taken an African American history class, okay? Because I know at Cass Technical High School, after I graduated in '89, so after I left, I know sometime after that, they instituted African American history class. I didn't have it when I was there, but I know some schools, Philadelphia, in the city of Philadelphia, I know it's mandatory in high school that students have to take at least one semester of African American history, an African American history class, right? So when you have a study like this and 1,000 out of 1,000 12th graders, only 8% know that slavery was the central reason why the Civil War was fought. Well, that's a huge problem. One, that means they didn't learn it in school, okay? Two, it means their parents didn't teach. So when we talk about teaching the accurate history of America, of slavery, right? Not only are students ignorant of this history largely, the teachers are largely ignorant of this history. This is why one of these studies, this is why a study like this is so important, okay? And this is why I talk about in a lot of my lectures and I use it to teach from. Because when we have debates over Confederate monuments and Confederate monuments being taken down, and you have an ignorant president who advocates for the Confederate monuments to be preserved. Well, this comes out of an ignorance of history because other countries don't honor their traitors. Other countries don't honor people who committed treason. So you have Donald Trump loosely throwing around the term treason, and he's proving he doesn't understand the U.S. Constitution because treason is defined in the U.S. Constitution in Article 3, Section 3. I mean, this is one of the dumbest ass people I've ever seen in my life. Seriously, this is one of the dumbest ass people I've ever seen in my life. When you look at President Obama had to be a super intellectual. I mean, he had to go above and beyond just to prove he was half as good. So you had Donald Trump demanding that President Obama not just present his birth certificate, but also present his high school, his college transcripts, because Trump didn't think that an African-American man could get exceptional grades. Yet Trump used Michael Cohen, and this is reported. Michael Cohen talked about this, his former attorney who's in prison right now. And Michael Cohen's in prison trying to figure out why Donald Trump's not in prison. And Michael Cohen is doing what Trump told him to do. It came out in Michael Cohen's testimony in front of the House Oversight Committee. I think it was a House Oversight Committee. Representative Elijah Cummings chairs that. Donald Trump used Cohen to intimidate Donald Trump's old high school to get them to suppress his high school transcripts of his grades, while he's demanding the college transcripts of President Obama. So you have Trump, who is advocating for the preservation of Confederate monuments. But when you understand the Confederacy, and this ties into the history of Juneteenth. I just talked to Bob Johnson today, who's the organizer of the huge 3-day Juneteenth festival and parade in Atlanta. So I'm headed to Atlanta in a few days because I'm speaking there. It's June 14th, Friday, June 14th through Sunday, June 16th. I'm speaking there, and I'll be a vendor also. All right. We have the information at our website, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. And also, if you'd like to donate to the African History Network, that helps, because that helps cover expenses traveling there and traveling back. Okay, paypal.me/the AHN show, paypal.me/the AHN show, or at our website, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. We just post the information. But when we look at the Confederate monuments, these were erected basically after the Civil War ends. Civil War is 1861, 1865. All this history ties into Juneteenth, June 19th, 1865, when General Gordon Granger goes into Galveston, Texas, and delivers General Order Number 3, which frees the 250,000 enslaved Africans there in Galveston, okay? And it was 250,000 in Texas. I'm not exactly sure if it was 250,000 specifically in Galveston, Texas. But this is 2 weeks after the Civil War ended. Civil War officially ended June 2nd, 1865. Now, some people mistakenly tie this to the Emancipation Proclamation of January 1st, 1863. And this is something that I'll explain when I speak at the festival. The Emancipation Proclamation did not free the enslaved Africans, so we shouldn't tie that to the Emancipation Proclamation. That's a misunderstanding of history. That was issued January 1st, 1863, after the Battle of Antietam, issued by President Abraham Lincoln. It was a military strategy. It was the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation was delivered September 22nd, 1862. This was designed to bring the South back into the Union. It was a threat to the South that if you do not come back into the Union, we're going to free your enslaved Africans. They designated those enslaved Africans as contraband. They were trying to rob the South of their enslaved Africans because they knew that the wealth of the South was tied to the enslaved Africans. So this was a military strategy. The goal of the Civil War was not to free the enslaved Africans. The goal of the Civil War was to bring the South back into the Union, because the first state to secede from the Union was South Carolina, December 20th, 1860. About 6 weeks after Abraham Lincoln became president-elect. He became president-elect November 6th, 1860. Okay. He was the candidate of the Republican Party. The Republican Party was the party basically of abolitionists. They were formed in 1854 by groups of abolitionists to be the counter to the Democratic Party. When he becomes president-elect, you have these southern states who fear that he's going to free the slaves. In his March 4th, 1861 inaugural address, This is after 7 states had seceded from the Union. You had South Carolina, December 20th, 1860. You had 6 more states by February of 1861. He delivers his inaugural address, March 4th, 1861, to try to appease the southern states to keep more of them from seceding to the Union. He, in his inaugural address, he talks about how he had no plans to end slavery in states where slavery already existed. Okay, now this is before the Civil War starts. Civil War is going to start April 12th, 1861, the following month. But you have these southern states seceding from the Union because they fear that Lincoln is going to free the slaves. And he's trying to tell them, no. He said, no, you slaveholding states. I'm not going to end slavery in those states. It's all right for you to keep those slaves. This is what he's trying to tell them. Okay, but then the Civil War starts with the attack on Fort Sumter in South Carolina, April 12, 1861. After that, all hell breaks loose. You're going to have more states that secede. But they committed treason against the United States, declared war on the U.S. They committed treason based upon Article 3, Section 3 of the U.S. Constitution. President Andrew Johnson, who succeeds Lincoln when Lincoln's assassinated, shot April 14th, at the Ford Theater, 1865. And he dies the next morning. After the Civil War, Johnson is going to give a blanket pardon to all the rebels, to the Confederates, because he was sympathetic to the Confederacy. Okay? So, but they committed treason against this country. Countries don't honor those who commit treason against them. Countries don't erect statues to those who commit treason against them. So all these Confederate statues that still exist, and you got about 12 or 14 in the US Capitol building as well, they're honoring traitors to this country. This is why all the Confederate monuments, even now people argue is part of history. Okay, that's true. It is part of history. It's part of the lowest history in this country. Now, I'm against Confederate monuments being destroyed. And I've done an entire lecture dealing with the history of Confederate monuments, the history of the Confederate flags, things like this. Because what people think is the Confederate flag, the flag that was on the Dukes of Hazzard car, and what was the name of that car? It was called the General Lee. And the car is named after General Robert E. Lee, who was a traitor to this country, who picked up arms and fought against the Union to preserve slavery in Virginia. Okay, that's who the car on the TV show The Dukes of Hazzard is named after. It's named after somebody who committed treason. He was also a brutal slave owner, by the way. Okay, there's an article from, I think it's the Atlantic.com, the called the Myth of the Kindly General Lee. All right, but what a lot of people don't know is that General Lee was against Confederate monuments. After the Civil War was over with, he was against using he was against having Confederate monuments. He was against using any of the Confederate flags also, as well. Yeah, the Atlantic.com. All right, I wanted to make sure because I read so many articles. June 4th, 2017, June 4th, 2017, the myth of the kindly General Lee, the legend of the Confederate leader's heroism and decency is based in the fiction of a person who never existed. This is a deep article here, all right? And you can tell Trump never read this article. Trump talked about Lee being a brilliant general and all stuff like this. Dude, you got a sitting president. Some people call him a fake president. I'm one of them. I call him the first Russian president of the United States. If you read the Mueller report, you know what I'm talking about. Volume 1 of the Mueller report. If you read the Mueller report, you know what I'm talking about. You know this ain't fake news. You know I'm telling the truth. He's the first Russian president of the United States. But Trump just recently was praising General Robert E. Lee. You have a sitting president praising someone who committed treason against this country? The myth of Lee goes something like this. He was a brilliant strategist and devoted Christian man who abhorred slavery and labored tirelessly after the war to bring the country back together. There is little truth in this. General Robert E. Lee was a devout Christian, and historians regard him as an accomplished tactician But despite his ability to win individual battles, his decision to fight a conventional war against the more densely populated and industrialized North is considered by many historians to have been a fatal strategic error. But even if one conceded Lee's military prowess, he would still be responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Americans in defense of the South's authority to own millions of human beings as property because they are Black. General Robert E. Lee's elevation is a key part of a 150-year-old propaganda campaign designed to erase slavery as the cause of the Civil War and whitewash the Confederate cause as a noble one. This is called this whole lost cause propaganda campaign that was pushed by the South. This is a 150-year-old propaganda campaign. Now that ideology is known as the lost cause. And as historian David Blight writes, it provided a, quote, foundation on which Southerners built the Jim Crow system, end quote. This is deep history. Now, this is who Trump was just praising a few months ago. See, this is why, once again, I have to go back to this study, because the reason why is because I've actually read it. This is why this is so important. This is why this study should be used by every school in this country. Okay? And one of the things they tell teachers don't do is don't do slave reenactments. Don't do mock slave auctions. Like you've seen some of my broadcasts where I talk about recently mock slave auctions that happened in Bronxville, New York. And we constantly see stories in schools of slave lessons gone wrong. They tell you in here, don't do that. They talk about how it traumatizes students, especially African-American students. Don't do mock Civil War enactments. Don't do slave auction reenactments. Don't have simulations of Black children picking cotton. Don't do none of that. They tell you this in here. And this is put together by a committee of historians, a committee of educators. Okay? So check out this article here from, this is a deep, deep article from theatlantic.com. I guarantee you Donald Trump has not read it. The myth of the kindly General Lee, the legend of the Confederate leader's heroism and decency is based in the fiction of a person who never existed. Now, what a lot of people don't know is that General Lee was against Confederate monuments after the Civil War ended. There were numerous times when he was asked to attend the unveiling of a Confederate monument in his honor, a monument of him, a monument dedicated to him. He always declined. He felt that after the Civil War ended, he felt that there needed to be a period of time for a healing to take place between the South and the North. The South was largely destroyed. I mean, there's still tensions, there's still hatred that the South has for the North. You had these Yankees that came through and wiped out their way of life, freed their 4 million, basically, it was about 3 million in the South, freed their enslaved Africans, wiped out their wealth, okay? So there was intense hatred still between the South and the North. So he felt there needed to be a period of time of healing. He was totally against Confederate monuments. He was against any of the Confederate flags. The flag that was on the General Lee car from the Dukes of Hazzard, that's not the Confederate flag. That's the Confederate battle flag of Northern Virginia under General Robert E. Lee's army. There were 3 flags that flew over the Confederate States of America from 1861 to 1865. That flag was never one of them. So when you see the white supremacists out with what they think is the Confederate flag, just by what they do, they show you how ignorant they are. So August of 2017, when you had the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, and that's when Heather Heyer, the white female activist, Heather Heyer, the anti-racist activist, she was killed. Okay, you had 12 white supremacist organizations that organized this Unite the Right rally. And they used the cover of preserving this statue of Robert E. Lee. They used that as a cover to organize, to have this rally. Now, Vice.com was there on the ground interviewing people, and they were like, dude, these people ain't talking about preserving this statue. That's not what they're talking about. Okay, Vice News, Vice.com. But when you study Robert E. Lee, he was against Confederate monuments, even the ones dedicated to him. So when you actually study this history, it shows you how ignorant a lot of these white supremacist organizations are. You are here organizing a rally to preserve a statue dedicated to a man who didn't want a statue. And then you're running around here waving this flag that you say is the Confederate flag, but it's not the Confederate flag. It's the Confederate battle flag of Northern Virginia under General Robert E. Lee's army. So when you listen to them, you see how ignorant a lot of them are because they have a poor understanding of history, but we have to understand they have been purposely miseducated. White people have been purposely miseducated in this country, in the school system. I know there are a lot of dedicated teachers. I'm not attacking the teachers. I'm dealing with the curriculum. I know there are a lot of dedicated teachers working 2 and 3 jobs. I come from a long line of teachers. I know teachers across the country are taking money out of their pockets to buy school supplies that the school is not offering them, even though you have certain people saying, oh, we should let the teachers carry guns. Okay, but they don't want to give them proper school supplies. They don't want to pay the teachers properly. I understand that. My mother taught for decades here in Detroit. I went through numerous teacher strikes. So I understand this. So I'm not attacking the teachers. I'm talking about the curriculum. Okay, so I know you have a lot of dedicated teachers of all races and all ethnic groups. But this is why something like this is so important, and it's free. This is why I don't understand why schools aren't using this. I know about it. My degree is not in education. How the hell I know about this and they don't? So those who have children in the school systems, public school systems, take this to your teachers, take this to the school board meeting, take this to the parent-teacher conference meeting, and say they need to implement this. Okay? Teaching Hard History, American Slavery from the Southern Poverty Law Center. We'll post a link here for you so you can download it. Let me pull this up. Teaching Hard History. Okay, African American business owners also post the name of your business here on the thread of the broadcast. We'll let you know how you can advertise with the African History Network. Email us at customerservice@africanhistorynetwork.com. Customerservice@africanhistorynetwork.com. Our current promotion, get 2 months for the price of 1. We have a new advertiser. We know that summertime is coming up. People want to get into shape, and the Fast Life 28-Day Challenge can definitely help you with this. Now, this is a 28-day challenge that deals with a fasting program. It's an online coaching program to help members tap into their body's natural ability to repair itself through fasting. Okay, in this challenge, they focus on utilizing fasting, whole foods, and movement to improve metabolic conditions such as obesity, high blood pressure, pre-diabetes, high cholesterol, fatty liver, and much more. They have a new group starting up very soon. Visit their website, tfl28.com, tfl28.com, for more information about the Fast Life 28-Day Challenge. They can definitely help you live a healthier lifestyle and get in shape for the summer as well. Okay, the Fast Life 28-Day Challenge. All right, so let's continue here. Post this here. All right, let's continue. Okay, so let's go back to the article for, let me see, did I post a link? I pulled it up here. Let me post a link for the study from the Southern Poverty Law Center. Okay, yeah, I just posted it. All right, let's continue. Let's go back to the original article from the from AtlantaBlackStar.com, AtlantaBlackStar.com. I have all these articles here, so you just have to bear with me, because I did a lot of research to prepare for this presentation. Okay, research by a female professor reveals startling truth that white women made up 40% of slave owners. Okay, so that was the original article we started talking about. How you all like this type of information? Okay, and I'll post a link again here for the online course we have starting up Wednesday, June 12th. Wednesday, June 12th, Ancient Kemet, the Moors, and the Maafa, Understanding the Transatlantic Slave Trade, what they didn't teach you in school. That'll be an 8-week, 16-hour online course. If you miss any of the sessions, it'll be all recorded. Go back and watch it over and over again. but I'm doing it live, first time in basically 2 years I've done this online course live. All right, so let's go back to this article. Okay, so Professor Stephanie E. Jones Rogers, who's an African-American female professor, demonstrates that in her book, name of the book is They Were Her Property, White Women as Slave Owners. In her book, by including interviews with formerly enslaved people conducted in the 1930s through the New Deal Agency Works Progress Administration. One formerly enslaved woman said children would ruthlessly beat enslaved people, okay? It didn't matter whether the child was large or small, they always beat you till the blood ran down, she said. Now, once they came of age, white women also reportedly got involved in the slave market. Aside from beating slaves, once they owned them, white women bought, sold, and sought out their return. Okay, so runaway slaves, they would have slave catchers. This was a whole profession to be a slave catcher. They would take out newspaper ads for runaway slave, wanted. Runaway slaves, give a description of them, and they will pay a bounty. All right. Now, the notion flips the previous belief of scholars that white women abstained from engaging in such activity as it was deemed improper. As the women got pregnant and had their own families, as white women got pregnant and had their own families, they reportedly orchestrated sexual assaults between enslaved people so that enslaved Black women could be available to nurse white women's children. Okay, so this is like breeding, okay, between an enslaved African man and an enslaved African woman. This, in addition to tearing enslaved women's babies away from them so they could nurse white women's children and avoid becoming, as Professor Jones Rogers stated, one white woman slave owner said, quote, a slave, end quote, to her children. One white woman described it as being a slave to her child. Advertisements for wet nurses, because they were called wet nurses. Advertisements for wet nurses, hold on, let's jump around. So advertisements for wet nurses were taken out throughout newspapers. They were plastered throughout newspapers, reportedly creating a massive market for enslaved Black women who recently delivered children. So this is something that's not talked about a lot. Now, there was a article from face2faceafrica.com, face2faceafrica.com, the word face, the number 2, faceafrica.com. This is from August 20th, 2018. You may have seen me post it before. It's called The Disturbing History of Enslaved Mothers Forced to Breastfeed White Babies in the 1600s. The Disturbing History of Enslaved Mothers Forced to Breastfeed White Babies in the 1600s. And so you know, you would ask the question, wait a second. If white people think that African people were inferior, and this is why they enslaved them, why would a white mother want an African-American mother to breastfeed her child? It's because they deem the breast milk of an African-American woman to be healthier for a child than the breast milk of a white woman. One. Two, it was looked at as being something that was, it was looked at as being, when you had slave owners, they were looked at as a dominant economic class, the genteel life. So it was also looked at something that was as laborious or something that was looked at as being beneath them, something to that extent, okay? So it was a combination of things, but the breast milk of African-American women was looked at as being healthier, and it would cause the child to grow up to be big and strong, okay? It would cause the child to be a healthier child. And you had some white women who looked at it as being a chore also, okay? Breastfeeding their baby routinely a number of times a day, they looked at that as being a chore. So if you have enslaved Africans to do all this other work that you don't want to do, well, you can have enslaved Africans to breastfeed your child also. So this is real history. Okay, this is all dealing with the history of slavery. Okay, this is real history. So check out this article from face-to-faceafrica.com, The Disturbing History of Enslaved Mothers Forced to Breastfeed White Babies in the 1600s. And recently, in the past few years, I have seen ads here in Detroit. I don't know if they had them across, I think they had them across the country, but I've seen ads here in Detroit on TV stations in Detroit talking about the health benefits of breastfeeding, but they were targeting African-American women. And what happened is that because of this, because of many African-American women being forced to be wet nurses, rented out as wet nurses during slavery, a stigma was attached to breastfeeding for African-American women. And this is something passed down generation after generation, but there's some type of stigma associated with breastfeeding. Now, also what happened and I'm not blaming anybody, but as more African-American women became professionals, got college degrees, became professionals, went out into the workforce, somehow breastfeeding became associated with something that poorer women did. So as they get degrees and as Similac and as formula is being pushed on them and marketed to them, right? Some African-American women started using formula, which is not nearly as healthy as breast milk, okay? But I'm not blaming African-American women, but this is all tied into the marketing and tied into a stigma. Breastfeeding became associated with something that poor women did, okay? And I think there's probably some type of stigma, still a residue existed handed down from slavery when African-American women were forced to be wet nurses also. So you had to have a marketing campaign, public service announcements, but a marketing campaign to reposition breastfeeding in the minds of many African-American women and talk about the benefits of it. It helps your child be healthier. It helps to immunize your child. It helps you drop pounds. It helps boost your metabolism, the mother. It helps you drop pounds drop the baby weight faster. There were a number of ads that were taken out. They were on radio and television to promote the health benefits of African-American women breastfeeding children, okay? That also helps to reduce like infant mortality, things like this, right? So it's a lot there, okay? So we're still, I talk about how we're all going through a 12-step process recovering from the side effects of white supremacy and racism, right? We're all going through this. We're all going through a 12-step process. And because after slavery ends, we never got psychological help, okay? And if you read Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome by Dr. Joy DeGroot, I have the book somewhere here in one of these 4 stacks of books. If you read Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome by Dr. Joy DeGroot, she talks about how when you have to learn to adapt to a hostile environment to survive, then so she's talking about slavery in this country, then after slavery ends, if you've never been taught to unlearn those behaviors, then you'll still exhibit a lot of those behaviors and pass them down generation after generation, okay? And I would argue that the environment was still hostile after slavery ended. It was just in a different way, okay? All right. So, and we know that mother's milk is for children, not cow's milk, right? Mother's milk is for children, not cow's milk. Cow's milk is for baby calves. Cow's milk is not for humans. The whole, see, my background's in marketing, so the whole push to get humans to drink cow's milk largely comes from the American Dairy Association. which through marketing campaigns promoted this. So like when we were growing up, we had the 4 basic food groups, okay? You have meats, grains, vegetables, and dairy products. And like in school, you know, they have that poster, they would have the poster on the wall of the 4 basic food groups. You need this number of servings a day from this group, that group, that group, right? Well, if you look at on the poster, who put that out? That was from the American Dairy Association. The American Dairy Association basically created the 4 basic food groups to sell more dairy products. And I remember seeing that in my marketing books when I was in college, taking marketing classes. I remember seeing that in the marketing books. So that's a whole marketing campaign to get people to drink cow's milk and to use dairy products from cows, made from cow's milk, that's not designed for humans. But that's all in the marketing. Marketing is dealing with crafting messages, you know, and you know, powers the ability to define and shape reality and have other people accept your definition of reality as if it were their own. This deals still with crafting messages and getting people to elicit a certain behavior that you want them to exhibit, that you want them to buy into. So now they have, I think it's like 9 food groups now. Okay, they realize the 4 is not adequate enough health-wise. So now they've expanded it. I think it's like 9 food groups. Okay, all right. So let's continue here. All right. So as the women got pregnant and had their own as the white women got pregnant and had their own families, they reportedly orchestrated sexual assaults between enslaved people so that enslaved Black women could be available to nurse white women's children. This, in addition to tearing enslaved women's babies away from them so they could nurse white women's children and avoid becoming, as Professor Jones Rogers stated, one white woman slave owner said, quote, a slave, end quote, to her children. Advertisements for wet nurses were plastered throughout newspapers, reportedly creating a massive market for enslaved Black women who recently delivered children. Professor Jones Rogers said, quote, there were instances in which formerly enslaved people did in fact say that their mistresses either sanctioned acts of sexual violence against them that were perpetrated at the hands of white men, or that they orchestrated instances of sexual violence between 2 enslaved people, one male, one woman, that they owned in hopes of producing children from those acts of sexual violence. So she's talking about how this was timed with the white woman becoming pregnant so that the African-American female slave would give birth around the time white woman gave birth, or would be lactating around the time that the white woman's child is born, so she could be a wet nurse to the slave woman could be a wet nurse to the white woman's child. All right. In the article from the New York Times, he talked about this also, if I remember correctly. Yeah, page 2 from the New York Times article. Previously invisible sectors of the market are illuminated, many created and controlled by white women. Historians long asserted, for instance, that Southern women use wet nurses only, quote, as a last resort, end quote. But the testimonies of formerly enslaved people and advertisements from the 18th and 19th centuries tell a different story. The practice appears to have been widespread. Now, the article from face-to-faceafrica.com, that talks about the 1600s. We're talking about the 18th and 19th century. We're talking about the 1700s and the 1800s. One woman recalled that her enslaved mother always gave birth at the same time as her mistress, so she would be able to, One woman recalled that her enslaved mother always gave birth at the same time as her mistress, so she would be available to nurse the white baby. Quote, these recollections make it clear that enslaved women were giving birth on a routine basis. But what often remains unexplored is what led to these constant conceptions. So we're, quote, undoubtedly the result of sexual assault. So what is happening here, and I've talked about this before, and we still see it today, is that the sexuality of African women was used as a commodity, and it was controlled by white people. So you have orchestrated breeding taking place of African women, okay, to benefit white women who are slave owners. There was an old stereotype of African American women, even after slavery ended, that you can't rape a Black woman. It goes back to this treatment during slavery of forced breeding, right? And how the conception happened, whether it's with a white man or an African slave. And African women being used as wet nurses. So when we have, for instance, and I'm going to go here with this, when we have, for instance, R. Kelly, and we look at the documentary Surviving R. Kelly, the multi-part series, I watched that on Lifetime. And I watched part of the follow-up that took place in May called the follow-up to it, to deal with the impact of Surviving R. Kelly. One of the recurring themes in Surviving R. Kelly was he was able to get away with what he was doing because no one cares when Black women are being sexually assaulted. If you go through and watch it, okay, and I watched it twice, okay, the 6-part series, that's one of the recurring themes. No one cares when Black women are being sexually assaulted. Well, there's a history to this going back to slavery. But if we don't really understand that history and put it to a proper context, then when we have the hypersexualization of African American women today in negative corporate controlled hip hop, and we still see a lot of those images, and we see the men in the movie, we see the men in the videos fully clothed and the Black women half naked, right? And her sexuality or her hypersexualization or the accentuation of certain body parts gives her worth. Okay, we see this still being perpetuated today. Okay, so let's continue here. Okay, so white women were also said to have gone through great lengths to maintain ownership of their slaves as the Civil War waged on. Now, History.com, the official website of the History Channel, in their article dealing with this, they're cited in the article from AtlantaBlackStar.com. I read the article from History.com also, the massive overlooked role of female slave owners, okay, the massive overlooked role of female slave owners. History.com reports that one woman named Martha Gibbs, Gibbs, forced enslaved Africans to Texas and threatened them with a gun to continue working for her through 1866, the year after slavery was officially abolished. So, you know, people are going to celebrate Juneteenth, right? And we're told this is when the enslaved Africans in Galveston, Texas got the word that they were free, okay? But even though I guess most of the slaves in Texas were free, all of them weren't free. Because Martha Gibbs was still working her enslaved Africans at gunpoint, at least part of the time, through 1866, okay? So even after the institution of slavery was outlawed, Southern white women reportedly doled out work contracts that exploited Black people to work under slave conditions. Some described it as a benign industry, as Margaret Mitchell did in the novel Gone with the Wind, that was turned into a movie about 1938, 39. And then we know that Hattie McDaniels wins an Oscar for Best Supporting Actress in 1939 for playing a slave. She played Mammy, I think her name was Mammy, in Gone with the Wind. The same idea has carried out through to textbooks discussing enslavement today. As recently as April 2018, it was exposed that students in Texas had been using a textbook that stated that not all enslaved Africans were unhappy. So they're trying to promote this myth of the happy slave. And this was part of that whole lost cause propaganda campaign for 150 years. The movie The Birth of a Nation was part of that as well. Debuted February 8th, 1915. And the movie The Birth of a Nation rejuvenated the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan had largely died out by about 1915. The Klan had largely died out. And the 1915 was the 50th year anniversary of the Civil War ending in 1865, and the 13th Amendment of 1865 was legally freed the enslaved Africans. But also it's the 50th year anniversary of the Ku Klux Klan being founded December 24th, 1865 in Pulaski, Tennessee. So the movie shows the Klan as being the heroes of the movie. And the movie takes place during slavery, the Civil War, and Reconstruction. And it takes place in Piedmont, South Carolina. And the slave owner is a doctor. And they showed the slaves on the plantation being happy and singing and dancing for the entertainment of the slave owners. And it basically shows the slaves as being like almost part of the family. Okay. Then the Civil War comes through and ravages South Carolina, ravages the South, totally destroys these white people's way of life. And the argument that the South was making during slavery and even after slavery was that the institution of slavery was a good institution for everybody involved. The kindly slave master looked out for his slaves, and they were almost like a part of the family, and he provided protection and provided food and clothing and shelter for the slaves, and the slaves in turn produced crops that the master could sell. And they talked about a checks and balance system, how slavery kept everything in check. And you had the South also arguing before slavery ended and after slavery ended, arguing that the enslaved Africans were too ignorant to be able to take care of themselves, and that the institution of slavery, and that slaves were better off under the institution of slavery because they were under the protection of the slave master, and he would provide for them. These are the arguments that they were making before and after slavery ended, the South. All right, so and you see this, the original movie, The Birth of a Nation, is on YouTube, okay? And you see this pretty much played out in that movie as well. It's a 3-hour movie, it's a silent movie, but you can watch it. And then you have to understand like the history behind the movie, but this is 50 years after the Civil War ends. This is the 1915, so that's the second year of World War I. World War I is 1914 to 1918. And this movie caused race riots in the streets also. President Woodrow Wilson had a private screening of a movie at the White House. It was directed by D.W. Griffith, okay? The movie, The Birth of a Nation, is based upon a novel by a man named Thomas Dixon. The name of the novel is called The Klansman, okay? About the Ku Klux Klan, The Klansman. And about the first month that the movie is out, the movie is actually called The Klansman, but then they're going to change the name of the movie to The Birth of a Nation. Now, so we go back to the article from AtlantaBlackStar.com. Even after the institution of slavery was outlawed, Southern white women reportedly doled out contracts that exploited Black people to work under slave-like conditions, okay? Still, Professor Stephanie E. Jones-Rogers argues in her book that white women's, quote, ideological and sentimental connections, end quote, to slavery were not the only thing that made them defend the practice of slavery. She remarked that women who were around during enslavement would have done the same thing, okay? All right, and once again, when we study this history, she's not talking about all white women. I'm not talking about all white women. I'm talking about all white people. We know all white people did not own slaves. We're talking about the ones who did, okay? So check out this article from AtlantaBlackStar.com. Research by Black female professor reveals startling truth that white women made up 40% of slave owners. This is written by Kirsten Willis, May 25th, 2019 for AtlantaBlackStar.com. So we'll post this link here. And then I'm going to go to the one from the New York Times and also History.com very quickly here to make sure I didn't forget anything, because I made notes in the margins of these articles. So just give me a second here. Let me look at my notes. Juneteenth gone with the wind. Okay, we got all that. All right, because I do preparation for these broadcasts also. How's everybody doing? How you like this type of information? Share this broadcast on your Facebook page. Invite your friends to tune in also. If you like this type of information, you can donate to the African History Network, paypal.me/the AHN show, paypal.me/the AHN show. This helps us keep doing the research, stay on the air, broadcast our normal Sunday night show on 9:10 a.m. the Superstation WFDF. On the radio, we broadcast on Facebook Live also. It also helps when I have to travel to different events and pay my way there, and it helps cover the cost of travel, helps go towards that as well. Okay, so paypal.me/the AHN show, or at AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. Click on the yellow donate button, because this will help pay to travel to Atlanta for the Juneteenth Festival. Then also we have the, and I'll do a brief overview of, a brief preview of the new online course I have starting up Wednesday, June 12th. It's called Ancient Kemet, the Moors, and the Maafa, Understanding the Transatlantic Slave Trade, What They Didn't Teach You in School. Ancient Kemet, the Moors, and the Maafa, Understanding the Transatlantic Slave Trade, What They Didn't Teach You in School. This is a 8-week, 16-hour online course. We'll deal with thousands of years of history. We'll deal with history leading up to the transatlantic slave trade taking place, get a better understanding of that. We'll understand ancient Egypt, ancient Kemet, the 800-year occupation of Europe by the Africans known as the Moors, which is extremely important to understand. We'll deal with Christopher Columbus, who helped to lay the foundation for slavery, racism, capitalism, the exploitation of indigenous people. And we'll deal with what leads to the transatlantic slave trade happening also. Okay, so just a second here. Let me look at my notes. Okay, so when we look at the article from history.com, it talks about how in her book, They Were Her Property, upends a lot of older scholarship. For example, previous scholars had argued that most Southern white women did not buy, sell, or inflict violence on enslaved people because this was considered improper for white women. But Professor Stephanie E. Jones-Rogers argues that white women were actually trained to participate from a very young age. She said, quote, their exposure to the slave market is not something that begins in adulthood. It begins in their homes when they're little girls, sometimes infants, when they're given enslaved people as gifts, okay? And she cited interviews with formerly enslaved people, as I said before. She cited interviews with formerly enslaved people conducted by the Works Progress Administration, right? And those interviews with formerly enslaved Africans shows the part of white children's training in plantation management involved beating enslaved people, okay? And then when it talks about for wet nurses, to this end, white women placed thousands of advertisements in newspapers looking for enslaved wet nurses to feed their own children, and created a huge market for enslaved Black women who had recently given birth. Okay, so this is still the marketing and the control and marketing of African women's bodies. Okay. All right, so they talk about going with the wind as well. Okay, so check out this article from history.com. The massive overlooked role of female slave owners. Okay, that's by Becky Little, March 12, 2019, history.com. And then I want to look at the article from New York Times because I made notes. Okay, so what's interesting here, they talk about some other books, some recent other books that have come out over the past few years dealing with the history of slavery. They mention The Half Has Never Been Told by Edward Baptist. And I've read excerpts of it. It looks like a really good book. I've seen interviews he's done. I know Roland Martin interviewed him also. But this is the article from New York Times. White women were avid slave owners, a new book shows. And on page 3 of the article, it says, in horrifying, meticulous detail, the book illustrates, referring to, I think they're referring to Edward Baptist's book. The book illustrates the centrality of violence to capitalism. Baptist argued the same point. They're talking about Professor Stephanie Jones Rogers' book, and they're comparing it to Edward Baptist's book. That's what it is. Baptist argued the same point in The Half Has Never Been Told. It was sheer brutality that dramatically increased the cotton yield between 1800 and 1860, he wrote, okay? And this is after the cotton gin is invented in basically 1793, and then you're gonna have copies of the cotton gin also, okay? And let me go to, let me bring the article up here on the computer. That's on page 3. Just a second here. All right, so it was sheer brutality that dramatically increased the cotton yield between 1800 and 1860, Edward Baptist wrote. No new technology or innovation surfaced in those years, but constant beatings, sexual abuse, and waterboarding had become common practices. In that era, quote, white people inflicted torture far more often than in almost any human society that ever existed, end quote. Okay, this is not, Edward Baptist is a white historian, and he's writing this. This is in the book, The Half Has Never Been Told. And if you go on YouTube, you can watch the interview that Roland Martin did with him on News One Now. Okay, yeah, News One Now, that used to be on TV One. Now, okay, let's see. But now, so during this time, 1800 to 1860, so the cotton gin is invented in 1793. 1803, you had the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, signed by President Thomas Jefferson. The U.S. gets about 828,000 square miles of land for less than 3 cents an acre. They're going to carve out about 15 new states out of this land. And they try to keep a balance between free states and new states. Now this gives, so what happens is, because of the Louisiana Purchase, and I just did a video dealing with how the Louisiana Purchase helped increase the demand for slaves. So watch that also on our YouTube channel, Michael Imhotep, IMHOTEP, or our Facebook fan page, The African History Network. Click on videos. Because Louisiana Purchase happens because of the Haitian Revolution and Toussaint Louverture and Bookman Dada, Dessalines, you know, they're beating the hell out of the French. It causes the French to sell their land here because France is about to go bankrupt. It causes them to sell their land here that they own, that they stole from Native Americans and African people who were already here for tens of thousands of years, by the way. France is trying to raise money, okay? So they sell all this land to the U.S., and it doubles the territory of the U.S. at the time, but it increases the need for slave labor as well, because you have all this fertile land and you want to grow crops. So increases the need for slave breeding, etc. Okay. And also it increases the need for Africans to be imported here as well as slaves. Okay. So not just slave breeding, but also increases the need for Africans to be imported here. Excuse me. Okay. So then in January 1st, 1808, we know that the law is passed that bans the transatlantic slave trade. That's passed by Congress March 2nd, 1807, based upon Article 1, Section 9 of the U.S. Constitution. This is why people need to read the U.S. Constitution. It stipulated that the importation of Africans as slaves would be outlawed at the earliest in 1808. So that law passes Congress March 2nd, 1807. It goes into effect January 1st, 1808, because that's the earliest it could go into effect based upon the U.S. Constitution. The framers of the Constitution, because they were debating at the Philadelphia Convention in 1787 whether to abolish slavery or not, they decided to put in a 20-year clause to allow those who wanted slavery to continue to bring in Africans to continue to make profits, and they were outlawed at the earliest in 1808. This is stipulated in Article 1, Section 9 of the U.S. Constitution. It's actually in the first, basically like the first paragraph or first two paragraphs. So that goes into effect January 1st, 1808. It outlaws Africans coming to this country as slaves, but it still allows slavery to exist in this country. Slave plantations, the auction blocks, the trading, all this stuff, the breeding. And what this does is this increases the need for slave breeding. Okay, now Europeans are still going to bring Africans into this country as slaves, but they're violating federal law when they do it. Okay, and we see this with the Clotilda of 1860 that comes into Alabama. With the slave owner, the slave owner was from Alabama. He lived in Alabama, and the Clotilda comes into Alabama in June or July of 1860, and it's illegal. It's illegal. This is human trafficking, but Europeans kept doing this after January 1st, 1808. Okay, so there's I interviewed Dr. Jahi Issa and Brother Reggie Marbury dealing with this history. And some of that history I already knew, but they went even deeper into it. They wrote an article in 2017 called Reparations is Dead. And scholars have ideas on how to revive it. I'll get to the exact name of the article here. But it deals with this history of how Europeans in this country continue to violate federal law by bringing Africans in this country as slaves, even though it was illegal. Okay, and it deals with how it was done to a much greater extent than originally we thought. Reparations is Dead, How to Resurrect It. That's the name of the article. Reparations is Dead, How to Resurrect It. Okay, with Dr. Jahi Issa and Brother Reggie Marbury. So read this article also. I did a 2-part interview with them that's archived in audio podcast format. So just go to AfricanHistoryNetwork.com, click on listen to podcasts, okay? Or wherever you get your podcast from, just search for the African History Network show, because we're on 8 different podcast platforms. And it should be there. All right. Okay, so let's continue here. So I think I got all of my notes. How you all like this type of information? So when I teach the online course, Ancient Kemet, the Moors, and the Maafa, Understand the Transatlantic Slave Trade, what they didn't teach in school, is not as depressing as this. Okay, but this is an important part of history, and this is recent research that is exposing this part of history. So this has to be taught, but the overall course is not this depressing. Okay. um, so if we look at this, let me bring up this. So I do a PowerPoint presentation. We'll deal with about 40, 50 articles in the class. We'll deal with recent archaeological discoveries. We'll deal with thousands of years of history. Let me turn on the screen share. I'll show you some of the slides. Because I do a PowerPoint presentation, we have video clips. I'll show you some of the information. We'll do a brief overview of it. So this is an 8-week course. It starts up Wednesday, June 12th, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Most of the sessions will be on Saturday around 4 p.m. Anything you miss, you can go back and watch it over and over again. This will be archived, and what happens is there's about 20 hours of bonus content in the previous course that I taught in September 2017. That's archived as well, so you'll have access to that, and you'll have access to the new class also. Anybody that's taking the previous class, email me at customerservice@africanhistorynetwork.com. We'll enroll you in the new one at 50% off. So this online course is $80, okay? And it's instructor-led, taught by myself. We get deep into this history. There's a lot of information here, okay? Let's see here. Let's bring this up. Let me go to the slide. So one of the things that I incorporated in the new class, we talk about the new study from the Southern Poverty Law Center that did not exist when I taught the class previously. So very briefly here, I first found out about the study from an article from theatlantic.com called "What Kids Are Really Learning About Slavery." What kids are really learning about slavery. A new report finds that the topic is mistaught and often sentimentalized, and students are alarmingly misinformed as a result, okay? So this statute, now some of you may have seen this statute before, okay, in various articles, etc. This is called the Lincoln Emancipation Statute, the Lincoln Emancipation Statute. And it was paid for by former enslaved Africans and erected in Washington, D.C. in 1876. And it has been criticized for representing the history of slavery from a paternalistic perspective, okay? So one of the things that the study from the Southern Poverty Law Center does is changes the perspective of the history of slavery. And one of the things they advocate for is using primary sources, using slave narratives, partly to teach the history of slavery also, okay? So it talks about how, 1,000 in the study, 1,000 American high school seniors and more than 1,700 social studies teachers across the country were surveyed. The group also reviewed 10 commonly used U.S. history textbooks and examined 15 sets of state standards to assess what students know, what educators teach, what publishers include, and what standards require or required vis-a-vis slavery, okay? Among 12th graders, only 8% could identify slavery as the cause of the Civil War. Fewer than 1/3, or only 32%, correctly named the 13th Amendment as the formal end of U.S. slavery. So 68% did not know it took a constitutional amendment to formally end slavery, okay? And these are 12th graders in school, and they don't know this. And fewer than half, only 46%, identified the Middle Passage as the transport of enslaved Africans across the Atlantic Ocean to North America. So read this article, "What Are Kids Really Learning About Slavery?" from theatlantic.com. So you have to wonder, what the hell are they learning, right? And the study outlined 7 key problems with the current way slavery is taught in American schools. Once again, this is not just schools where African Americans are the predominant student body. This is talking about schools across the country. One, we teach about slavery without context, preferring to present the good news before the bad. They don't present it within the context of history and the context of understanding white supremacy and racism. 2, we tend to subscribe to a progressive view of American history that can acknowledge flaws only to the extent that they have been addressed and solved, not the flaws that still exist, not the vestiges of slavery, not the vestiges of racism, okay? But only understanding slavery to the extent of what has been solved, what has been addressed, what has been eradicated. 3, we teach about the American enslavement of Africans as an exclusively Southern institution, and it was not. When we look at the 13 colonies, all 13 colonies had slavery, okay? And even when the Civil War takes place, okay, even when the Civil War happens, and when you have the Emancipation Proclamation, right, it did not affect the border states, okay, like Maryland and Kentucky, things like this, okay? The border states are still allowed to maintain slavery, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, okay? When we study this history and study the Emancipation Proclamation, those states stay in the Union. They are allowed to maintain their slaves, all right? And then states that territories of the Confederacy that had come back under control of the Union, they were still allowed to maintain their slaves. When you actually read the Emancipation Proclamation, you can go to archives.gov, which is the official website of the National Archives, or you can go to loc.gov, which is the Library of Congress website, okay? And you can read the Emancipation Proclamation there. When you read it, they have all these exceptions to all these territories, all these areas that are exempted from the Emancipation Proclamation. So it did not free the enslaved Africans. That's going to be the 13th Amendment that does this. Okay, let's go back. And most people don't know this. All right, so we talk about the American enslavement of Africans as an exclusively Southern institution, okay? Number 4, we rarely connect slavery to the ideology that grew up to sustain and protect it, white supremacy. So this is why this study is so important, because they specifically mention white supremacy, okay? And you have to deal with that to deal with the inception of slavery in this country and deal with what's going on today. We often rely on pedagogy poorly suited to the topic when we ask teachers to tell us about their favorite lesson when teaching about slavery. Dozens of teachers proudly reported classroom simulations. That's a no-no. If you've seen some of my broadcasts about slave lessons gone wrong, you know that's a no-no. Don't do reenactments of slavery and reenactments of slave auctions and reenactments of picking cotton. Don't have Black children doing that. No. Simulation of traumatic experiences is not shown to be effective as a learning strategy and can harm vulnerable children. They tell you this in the study. 6, we rarely make the connections to the present. We rarely connect slavery to the ideology that grew up to sustain and protect the white supremacy. Now, how can students develop a meaningful understanding of the rest of American history if they do not understand the scope and lasting impact of enslavement? Reconstruction, the Great Migration, the Harlem Renaissance, and the Civil Rights Movement do not make sense when so divorced from the arc of American history. So one of the things that I deal with in the online course is we deal with this history chronologically. When we deal with the transatlantic slave trade, we can't deal with it as an episode in history. It did not just fall out of the sky. It wasn't just something that popped up out of the ground like flowers. It was the result of a sequence of historical events, and you have to deal with the 800-year occupation of Europe by the Africans known as the Moors, and the tensions and the fights and the clashes and the wars that developed between the Moors and Europeans. When the Portuguese are the first ones involved in the transatlantic slave trade, you see the Moors going into Europe, basically through Morocco. When you look at a map, Spain and Portugal are right above Morocco. Morocco's in North Africa. When the Portuguese first get involved in the transatlantic slave trade in the 1440s, that's not their first contact with African people. They had been dealing with them for hundreds of years at least. And yes, there were Africans in Europe prior to 711 AD when the Moors go into what was then called the Iberian Peninsula, today known as Spain and Portugal. Well, we just look at that period of time. They knew who African people were. The Spanish, the Portuguese, the Germans, the Austrians, the English, they had been dealing with African people for basically hundreds of years. They did not just come in contact with them during the transatlantic slave trade. When you understand the transatlantic slave trade as a continuation of a chronology of history and the continuation of the clashes between Africans, the African Moors specifically, and Europeans, then you understand the transatlantic slave trade was really more like Europeans getting revenge on the Moors and getting revenge on Africans, who they have been fighting for hundreds of years, even though it was the Moors who take the teachings from ancient Kemet, ancient Egypt into Europe and bring Europe out of the Dark Ages. This is why you can't start studying the transatlantic slave trade in the 15th century, because when I was taking Africana studies classes over 20 years ago at Wayne State University, they're starting our history. They're starting when they're dealing with the history of African people, they're starting in basically the 15th century. Now, I'm going into class already studying Dr. John Henry Clark, Dr. Yosef Ben Yakinen, Dr. Ivan Van Sertima, Dr. Naim Akbar. I'm already studying ancient Kemet. I've already read Black Man of the Nile and His Family by Dr. Yosef Ben Yakinen. And, and I'm like, well, wait a second, man, how you skip all these thousands of years of ancient Kemet and Nubia and all this? How are you skipping over all this history and you starting dealing with slavery? But this is how oftentimes the history is taught. It's taught episodically. It's taught as an episode in history. You can't teach it episodically. You have to teach it chronologically, because you have to deal with historical events that lead up to the transatlantic slave trade happening. Okay, so let's continue. Let's go back to the screen share. If you need me to post a link again for the online course so you can register for it, let me know. We'll post that. How you doing, Sean and Quentin, Erica? How's everybody doing? Okay, so now this is from page 10 and 11, okay, of the study from the Southern Poverty Law Center called Teaching Hard History of American Slavery, because I've incorporated this into the online course. When I taught the course 2 years ago, this study did not exist. Okay, so people taking this course for the first time, you're getting a lot of new information. Okay, so number 5, we often rely on pedagogy poorly suited to the topic. Okay, number 6, we rarely make connections to the present. All right, even when we deal with the Great Migration, 1914 to 1915 to 1970, the Great Migration, 6 million approximately African Americans migrate from the South up north and out west. What really kicks that off is World War I. The auto industry and Henry Ford has part to do it, but it really kicks off with World War I. That has to be taught chronologically. And during that period of time of the Great Migration, you have the Harlem Renaissance, which goes back to the 1910s and goes into about the 1930s, okay? So the Great Migration, the Harlem Renaissance, and all this is going to lead up to the Civil Rights Movement happening. The World War II, which is during the Great Migration, and these African-American men coming back. We just commemorated D-Day, 75th anniversary of D-Day, and there were about 2,000 African-American men who fought in D-Day, served there, who were in Normandy. And when I felt sorry for them, this is why I posted so many articles about this on our fan page, the African History Network, because I'm watching the coverage on MSNBC, and they said very little about these African-American soldiers. There were about 155,000 U.S. soldiers who landed in Normandy, June 6, 1944, okay? But there were 2,000 of them African-Americans. They were almost just totally whited out. Now, NBCnews.com did have an article about them. We posted that a couple of times. History.com did, but when I'm watching MSNBC, I saw very little talk about that. I don't understand how you do that. I don't understand how you do something like that. Okay, so 6, we rarely connect the ideology that grew up to sustain and protect white supremacy. Okay, and what's going to happen is when these African American men come back from World War I, see, World War II. During World War II, let me take the screenshot. During World War II, because of the racism that's taking place in this country, African American men had, and it was, I think it was the Pittsburgh Courier, African-American newspaper that started this. It was called the Double V campaign, the Double V campaign. Victory abroad, fighting against fascism, fighting against the Nazis, fighting against Hitler. Okay. Victory at home, fighting against Jim Crow and racism. There was a Double V campaign. So when these brothers come back home after serving their country, shedding blood overseas, they're saying, wait a second, no, we want all of our rights now. He said, we're not going to deal with this segregation and Jim Crow, all this stuff. We want all of our rights now. The goal was not to sit on the toilet next to white people. They were saying, we want full class citizenship now. And you saw efforts dealing with this. Even going back to June 25th, 1945, when you have Executive Order 8802. Executive Order 8802. This is during, let me see, June 25th, 1941. Go back, June 25th, 1941, Executive Order 8802. And this was A. Philip Randolph, who was the president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. This is during the time that the U.S. is the arsenal of democracy, but it's before the U.S. actually gets involved in fighting World War II. This is before Pearl Harbor is attacked, okay, in December of 41. So this is June 25th, 1941, okay, and Britannica.com has a good article about this. I've talked about this before. Executive Order 8802, June 25th, 1941. And this was an executive order that desegregated jobs in the Department of Defense for African Americans, okay? So you had a lot of African Americans migrating from the South up north, getting these Defense Department jobs, making military equipment, okay? And they're able to live a middle class life. Well, it was President Roosevelt who signed that executive order. Well, he didn't sign it out of the kindness of his heart. His hand was forced by A. Philip Randolph, who was the president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. A. Philip Randolph threatened to put 100,000 African Americans marching on Washington to embarrass President Roosevelt if he did not desegregate jobs in the Defense Department. This is how Executive Order 8802 came about. If you read the article from Britannica.com, which is the official website of Encyclopedia Britannica, they have an article called Executive Order 8802. And it talks about how it was enacted on June 25th, 1941 by President Roosevelt that helped to eliminate racial discrimination in the U.S. defense industry and was an important step toward ending racial discrimination in federal government employment practices, okay? But then they talk about A. Philip Randolph, and he had long fought for African-American rights and employment opportunity, et cetera. But he threatened to put 100,000 African-Americans marching on Washington, D.C. When A. Philip Randolph and other civil rights leaders tried to persuade President Roosevelt to end discrimination in defense industry employment, the president rebuffed them. Randolph responded by threatening to organize a large march on Washington, D.C. Roosevelt recognized that the presence of possibly 100,000 or more protesters in the nation's capital could be embarrassing and would distract attention from more pressing matters. In order to appease the civil rights leaders, especially A. Philip Randolph, President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 8802, which specified that there would be no discrimination in the U.S. defense industry on the basis of race, color, or national origin. The executive order did not establish full employment equality, but it did establish a Fair Employment Practices Committee, the FEPC, okay? But what it did do is open up a lot of these Defense Department jobs for African Americans to get, and it helped to increase the number of middle-class African Americans. All right. We'll post a link to that article. That's from Britannica.com, okay? So when we deal with this history, we have to deal with it chronologically because one event leads to the other. So when these brothers come back home, you know, Medgar Evers was one of them. You know, when these brothers come back home, they're getting involved in fighting for civil rights. You have the desegregation of the armed forces in about 1947, okay? And you have different instances that happen. And then you're going to have the Emmett Till, or you have May of 1954, Brown versus Board of Education, okay, desegregation case, U.S. Supreme Court desegregation case. And then you're going to have Emmett Till, August of 1955. Emmett Till is killed, okay? Then in December 1955, you have the Montgomery bus boycott, which starts December 5th, 1955, okay? And some people start the modern day civil rights movement with Emmett Till, the killing of Emmett Till, and then the trial of him and the effort of the NAACP and Medgar Evers, who's there in Mississippi. Medgar Evers helps to gather evidence, you know, and do interviews with people, gather evidence on what happened to Emmett Till. All right. Some people started the modern day civil rights movement with Brown versus Board of Education, which helped to lay the foundation for using the federal courts, the U.S. Supreme Court, as a strategy to get some type of justice for African Americans. Because when you look at the Montgomery bus boycott, and I have a whole presentation that I do dealing with the distortion of Dr. King's legacy. When you look at the Montgomery bus boycott, the boycott, what ended segregation on the buses in Montgomery, Alabama, was not the boycott, even though the boycott was necessary. What ended segregation on the buses in Montgomery, Alabama, was the lawsuit of Browder versus Gale, filed February 1st, 1956. Okay, and there were four plaintiffs, four African American women: Aurelia S. Browder, Mary Louise Smith, Susie McDonald, and Claudette Colvin. These were four African American plaintiffs. These were all women who at various times refused to give up their seats on the Montgomery bus system. The plaintiff was William A. Gale, G-A-Y-L-E, who was the mayor. The defendant, William A. Gale. And then they also sued, so they sued the mayor, they sued the police chief, they sued Montgomery Bus Lines, Inc., they sued some other people as well, okay? This case goes all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. It's the U.S. Supreme Court that's going to rule. They originally ruled in November 56, then there are some appeals. But the U.S. Supreme Court rules in favor of the African Americans and they say it's unconstitutional to segregate the buses. So because of that U.S. Supreme Court ruling, that's what actually ends segregation on the buses. So December 20th, 1956, because the appeals are exhausted, they have a meeting and they decide, the Montgomery Improvement Association, and they decide to end the bus boycott, okay? Because the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled on this. That's what ended segregation on the buses. Even though the boycott was necessary, they had the lawsuit was filed by Fred Gray, attorney Fred Gray, and they had a three-pronged strategy. They had the mass protests, okay? They had the economic boycotts of the bus system, but they also had the legal strategy of the courts. Okay, so this is what ends segregation. It wasn't the boycott. So a lot of people don't understand that history. All right, so when we teach the history of the civil rights movement, it has to be in context and it has to be taught chronologically, coming out of World War II. Okay, dealing with Brown versus Board of Education, 1954, dealing with Emmett Till's killing in August of 1955 in Money, Mississippi. All right, and tying that into the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, A. Philip Randolph, decades before that. And before Brown versus Board of Education, the previous year, 1953, you have the Baton Rouge, Louisiana bus boycott of 1953 that lasted 8 days, led by the Reverend T.J. Jemison. A lot of people don't know about this one. There's a documentary about that boycott that I watched, because I did research on that one, that served as a template for the Montgomery bus boycott, because Dr. King and others, E.D. Nixon, who was a local leader of the NAACP, and one of the organizers of the Montgomery bus boycott, they contacted Reverend T.J. Jemison to get advice on how to run their bus boycott. And this is where they get the idea of having a dispatch system, because in Montgomery, they had a 300-car dispatch system to dispatch cars to take people to run errands and go back and forth to work and things like this. See, they got that from the 1953 Baton Rouge, Louisiana bus boycott. Okay, so you have to understand a chronology of this history. So these are some of the things that we deal with in the online course. All right, how's everybody doing? The internet is lagging. Let's see here. Sean, Quentin. Okay, how's the internet now? How are we doing? Okay, because I'm also recording this with my video camera as well. I got a second camera recording this, and then I'm also recording this with Audacity for the audio podcast of this as well. So how's the video now? Is the video all right? Because it looks all right on my end. I'm monitoring this on the second laptop. Okay, so let's continue here. How you all like this type of information? Jolyn, how you doing, Jolyn? Sean, okay, and Keith. All right, so number 6, okay, we got the screen share back on. Number 6 is we rarely connect slavery to the ideology that grew up to sustain and protect white supremacy, okay? Number 7, we tend to center on the white experience when we teach about slavery, and the study recommends to read slave narratives. Slave narratives are extremely important. One of them is by Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass wrote 3 autobiographies, okay? His first one is the life and narrative of Frederick Douglass. Now, too often, the varied life experience of enslaved people is neglected, while educators focus on the broader political and economic impacts of slavery. Politically and socially, we focus on what white people were doing in the time of slavery leading up to the Civil War. We can and must do better, okay, it talks about. And one of the things that Professor Stephanie E. Jones did was she looked at the slave narratives after, from the 1930s, about a Works Progress administration. And you get firsthand account of former slaves telling you about the involvement in slavery of white women. Okay, so and then I talk about some of the studies that talk about the positive impact that African American history has on our children as well. Okay, this is one of the recent ones. New studies find that positive feelings about Blackness improve academic performance for Black girls. TheRoot.com had an article about this. Name of the article: New studies find that positive feelings about Blackness improve academic performance for Black girls. This is from January 10th, 2018. And let's see, there was an article in the Journal of Blacks in Higher Education. So when you go in to talk to the principals, teachers, school board, things like this, take articles from the educational journals, because they're expecting you to go in with feelings and emotions, not facts and evidence. When you go in with facts and evidence, you're going to catch them off guard, because a lot of times they haven't even read these studies. A lot of times they haven't even read these articles. But an article in the Journal of Blacks in Higher Education focuses on a new study from Professor Sharita Butler Barnes, a professor at Washington University in St. Louis, which finds that young Black women with strong racial identity are more likely to be academically engaged, curious, and persistent. Okay, hold on, I went the wrong way. So the survey looked at 733 Black middle and high school girls in 3 socioeconomically school districts in the Midwest, according to the Journal of Blacks in Higher Education. Now, the study is entitled Promoting Resilience Among African American Girls. Promoting Resilience Among African American Girls. Racial Identity as a protective factor. Racial identity as a protective factor. And this study was published on the Child Development Journal website, the Child Development Journal website. And this study found that feeling positive about being Black, along with feeling supported by their schools, correlated with the girls' greater academic motivation. Well, feeling positive about being Black ties into what you know about your history. What you do for yourself, what you do to yourself, and what you allow other people to do to you is based upon what you think about yourself. What you think about yourself is based upon what you have been taught about yourself. What you've been taught about yourself is based upon everything you've read, heard, and seen about yourself. Now, researchers also found that feeling good about your racial identity could act as a buffer for students in, quote, hostile or negative, end quote, academic environments. I would argue it would act as a buffer outside of academic environments, like out in regular society, okay? Especially in this Trump administration. Hostile or negative academic environments. Quote, persons of color who have unhealthy racial identity beliefs tend to perform lower in school and have more symptoms of depression, Professor Sharita Butler Barnes noted. Quote, we found that feeling positive about being Black and feeling support and belonging at school may be especially important for African American girls' classroom engagement and curiosity. Feeling connected to the school may also work together with racial identity attitudes to improve academic outcomes. You can read the full article, read the actual study as well. So this article came, there were numerous articles written about this. This one here is from theroot.com. New studies find that positive feelings about Blackness improve academic performance for Black girls, okay? This is a study from 2012. TV kills Black boys' self-esteem. A new, precise, and exhaustive year-long study finds that watching television regularly distorts and ultimately destroys the self-esteem of young Black males who often find themselves comparing one another to the characters they view on air, leaving them feeling trapped and as if they are, quote, very few positive life paths they can aspire to. This is an article from blackamericaweb.com entitled TV Kills Black Boys Self-Esteem. I read the study. I read a number of articles about this study. Now, when CNN had their article about this study, the article from CNN talked about how TV boosts white boys' self-esteem, but it did not boost the self-esteem of white girls and African-American boys and girls, okay? But they talked about how TV boosts white boys' self-esteem. This was like the headlines from CNN for about the same study, okay? So this one here, AfricanGlobe.net had an article about this study. Now, this was a joint study by University of Pittsburgh and Harvard University. Black teens with racial pride do better in school. Black teens with racial pride do better in school. African-American teenagers perform better academically when their parents instill in them a sense of racial pride, a sense of racial pride. A new study by the University of Pittsburgh and Harvard University shows that when parents use racial socialization, such as talking to their children or engaging in activities that promote feelings of racial knowledge, pride, and connection, it could be taking them to the African American Museum, taking them to a Dr. King Day celebration. Hopefully it's not one of the watered down ones. Taking them to Kwanzaa celebrations, African American History Month, Marcus Garvey Day celebrations, Malcolm X Day celebrations, things like this. Juneteenth, okay, and learning the real history of Juneteenth, not the fake history, okay, saying we were free 2 years ago, 2 years prior by the Emancipation Proclamation and all this stuff, but really understanding the real history of Juneteenth, okay? When parents involve their children, engage their children in activities that promote feelings of racial knowledge, pride, and connection, it offsets racial discrimination's potentially negative impact on students' academic development. Now, this was a joint study by the University of Pittsburgh and Harvard University. You have white universities doing these studies. They know the positive impact that teaching our children their history has on them. So my argument would be, why isn't the history of African Americans taught in every school across the country? The evidence is there. So why isn't Why hasn't the curriculum been corrected? All right. So we deal with things like this. That's Lupita Nyong'o. We deal with when she was named by People Magazine, most beautiful person by People. Okay, so very quickly here. So we talk about Black Panther as well. That ties into African history and culture also. So here's some of the things that we deal with. What was the transatlantic slave trade? What were some of the events that led up to the transatlantic slave trade starting? And I deal with a chronology of history. I deal with a timeline of history also, so we can understand things chronologically. What role did Christopher Columbus play? Okay, because Columbus is essential to the spread of racism, capitalism, the exploitation of indigenous people, and slavery spreading. He's essential to this. When did Africans first come to the U.S. as slaves? And also, we were here for tens of thousands of years as well. This is one of the things I deal with. I deal with the African presence in this country going back at least 51,700 years ago. This is one of the sources I use in the class. The book from my friend, Dr. David Imhotep, The First Americans Were Africans, Documented Evidence. His book thoroughly documents an African presence in this country going back at least 51,700 years ago. These were the Khoisan. The Khoisan are the short-statured Africans, the ancestors to the Ainu and the Twa. They come from southern Africa. They go all around the world. So that's one of the sources. Now, you don't have to buy any of these books to follow along in the course, but I use different sources to document what I'm talking about. So, so we deal with the African presence in this country going back at least 51,700 years ago, and there's new evidence in Brazil putting that back at least 100,000 years ago as well. Okay, let's continue here. How's everybody doing? How you all like this type of information? Got Jolyn, Patricia, Momorazi, Sean. Sean said you're a walking library. I'm trying to hold back. I'm trying not to go. I'm trying not to make this too long of a video. So I'm like really holding back. I have to grab myself to keep from making this like a 4-hour video because my voice is being strained right now also. Okay, how's everybody doing? All right, okay, so we'll post a link again so you can register for this online course. As soon as you register, you can watch about 20 hours of bonus content that we already have recorded. And you can watch the previous course I did back in September 2017. All that's archived. And then it will enroll you in the class that starts Wednesday, June 12th, 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And then basically each week after that, it's going to be pretty much each Saturday, about 4 p.m. In each class, we'll do it live. You can do the live chat in the class. It's not on Facebook. It's out at our online school. But each class is archived, so you can go back and watch it over and over again also. Okay, so what role did Christopher Columbus play? When did Africans first come to the U.S. as slaves? Now, see, this is important because this year we celebrate, many people commemorating August 20th, 1619, right? When those 29 Africans came into Jamestown, Virginia on the White Line slave ship, okay? And they were exchanged for food and supplies and water. They were stolen from Angola, okay? They were originally stolen from Angola. It was originally a Portuguese slave ship called the San Juan Batista. And that Portuguese ship is hijacked by English pirates around the Gulf of Mexico. It's 50 of them, 50 Africans taken on the 2 slave ships, the White Line and the Treasurer. The White Line and Treasurer come into Jamestown, Virginia, August of 1619. And 29 Africans on the White Lion ship are traded for food and supplies and water, okay? One of the things I'm going to go deep into in the class, somewhat deep in, is at this time in 1619 in the British colonies, there are no slave statutes. The status of slave does not exist. The colony to first have slave statutes was Massachusetts in 1641. When those 29 Africans come in, they're put into indentured servitude. After about 3 or 5 years or so, they're released and compensated with land. We refer to slavery starting in 1619 because these Africans were stolen. See, you got to keep in mind the Portuguese dominated the slave trade for the first 200 years, from about 1440 to 1640. The Portuguese got involved before the English, before the British. And different things are taking place in different colonies of these different European nations. But at this point in time, slave statutes don't even exist in the British colonies. They don't come to Virginia till 1661. They start in Massachusetts in 1641. This is why you have to understand the chronology of history. A lot of people, this is a very nuanced history that a lot of people don't understand. Okay? So these are some of the things that we're going to deal with. We're going to look at some recent events that have taken place that have brought this history to the forefront. So we deal with history in the headlines also. That's why I have so many articles we'll deal with. We have history in the headlines. All right. So we'll deal with that. We'll deal with, let me go back the wrong way. So when we look at the Spanish were taking Africans into the territory we call South Carolina and Florida in the 1520s, especially 1526. Okay, these were Spanish colonies. This was 100 years before Jamestown, Virginia. So even though, so once again, we have to look at, right? And I called in the Reverend Al Sharpton's radio show, Keeping It Real, on February 13th, 2019, and citing historical sources, tried to explain this nuanced history to him, but he still didn't understand, okay? I still love him, but, the way we think that slavery originated in 13 colonies is not necessarily the way that it actually happened. This is why we have to understand the chronology of history. Okay. And if you read Before the Mayflower by Lerone Bennett Jr., chapter 2, Lerone Bennett Jr. gets deep into it. So this is why I'm careful of generalizations about the history of slavery. Yes, we know it was brutal and it was wrong and things like that, but the way it originated in the British colonies ain't the way we think it happened. Okay. And just because they were doing something in the Spanish colonies does not mean they were doing it in the British colonies. The Spanish got a head start on slavery before the British. So you have to deal with specifically which colonies you're talking about and which period of time you're talking about. Okay, let's continue here. So we just posted the link again here. You can click on the link. This is to register for the online course and get more information. Ancient Kemet, the Moors, and the Maafa, Understanding the Transatlantic Slave Trade, what they didn't teach you in school. 2019 editions, 8-week, 16-hour online course. A lot of bonus content that is already available for you. Is $80, is regularly $130. So as soon as you register, you can start watching content. It's going to blow you away. You can watch from around the world over and over again. I do a PowerPoint presentation, video clips, articles, book references. Okay, so it's deep. Let's continue here. Let's bring this back up. Okay, let's go back to the screen share. If you have any questions, go ahead and post your questions here also. And also you can email me at customerservice@africanhistorynetwork.com, customerservice@africanhistorynetwork.com. And if you've taken the online course that I've done anytime in the past, email me at customerservice@africanhistorynetwork.com. I'll enroll you in a new course at 50% off. So it'll be $40 for you. Okay, I have limited space, but we'll do that for you also, because you're going to get a lot of new information. All right, let's do this. And then also African-American business owners, post the name of your business here on the thread of the broadcast. We'll let you know how you can advertise with the African History Network, customer service at AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. And we have a new advertiser also. Let's see here, who we have here. We have, it's 2019 and people want to get their financial house in order. And certified financial planner Martisha Patterson can help you with that, whether you want to create investment strategies, whether you want to create a budget, you want to do a saving for emergencies or retirement, you want to start investing. She's a certified financial planner with 19 years of experience in the industry. She's an African-American female as well. I've interviewed her before. Visit her website, pattersonplans17.com, pattersonplans17.com, okay? And she can help you get started today. You want to start saving for your college, you want to start investing and saving for your child's college tuition, so you don't have to use retirement money or saddle your child with student loans. She can help you with this, okay? And then also for those who are health conscious, Mercedes Waffles and More can help you because they have fantastic vegan and vegetarian soul food, vegan and vegetarian soul food. They service, they are catering only. They service the New Jersey and New York area. Visit their website, mercedeswafflesandmore.com, mercedeswafflesandmore.com. If you want healthy vegan and vegetarian soul food, this is the catering company to look at, mercedeswafflesandmore.com. All right, so let's go back to the PowerPoint. Okay, so this was the study from the University of Pittsburgh and Harvard University, dealing with African-American teens with racial pride do better in school, okay? And let's continue here. Okay, it went back the wrong way. All right, so we deal with the complicated history that Africans sell themselves into slavery. When did Africans first come to the U.S. as slaves? We do with African presence going back at least 51,700 years ago. Also, with African people in America before the slave trade, yes, we were. This was our land stolen from us. When our children learn that there were pyramid mounds here, and mounds, there were 1 million mounds in this land. There are only about 100,000 today. One of the largest ones called Cahokia in East Illinois. They were mounds that we built up and down the Mississippi River. When they understand the African presence that was here for tens of thousands of years before Native Americans came into existence, they understand that this was our land stolen from us. It would have a seismic shift in the way they see themselves, see their history, see their ancestors. And your thoughts create feelings, your feelings create actions and behaviors, your actions and behaviors create results. You know, how you perceive yourself is tied to your self-esteem. What you know about yourself is tied to your self-esteem. We'll do with the 800-year occupation of Europe by the Africans known as the Moors, shocking archaeological discoveries that are causing experts to rethink everything. And there are new discoveries coming out every month or every other month. I'm seeing them. The new archaeological discoveries that causing scientists and archaeologists and paleontologists to have to push the timelines back. They keep having to back that thing up. Like Juvenile said, Juvenile had a song back in like 1988. 89, back that thing up. Every time these archaeological discoveries come out, they keep having to back the timelines up. Insurance companies that took out insurance policies on slave ships and enslaved Africans on the plantations. There were Freemasonry, America, and the Founding Fathers. Origins of the terms America, Africa, and more. The problem with slave movies, us being bombarded with slave movies, and this is one of the reasons why the movie Black Panther did so well, because it was not another slave movie. A lot of African Americans are tired of slave movies, right? And it showed Wakanda, a fictitious African nation. Wakanda is a real word. This is one of the things I deal with in my lectures dealing with the film Black Panther, because I've done extensive research on Black Panther, the Black Panther comic book, language, things like this. The language spoken in the film is called isiXhosa, which is a Bantu language, and is spoken in Southern Africa. There's one of the nations that speaks Bantu. This speaks isiXhosa. And Wakanda is a real word. We see it's a Bantu word, but also we see it in Native American languages like the Sioux Indian, the Omaha Ponca language. It means possesses secret powers. So even though Wakanda is a fictitious African nation, this ties into African history and culture as well. So it's a deep history that I get into when I do my presentations dealing with the film Black Panther. All of my lectures are available at our website, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. We have lectures dealing with Black Panther. We have them in a bundle pack also. We'll post a link to a 6 DVD bundle pack that I did dealing with the film Black Panther, and those in Atlanta. When I come for the Juneteenth celebration, I'll have my DVDs dealing with Black Panther there also. This is one I did for children as well. Osset, and Heru, who the Greeks called Osiris, Isis, and Horus, and the origins of the Immaculate Conception story, links to ancient Kemet, Egypt, and early Christianity, Freemasonry in America, and the fake Willie Lynch letter 1712, because Willie Lynch never historically existed, okay? This is Runoko Rashidi. You hear me talk about Runoko a lot, and I've interviewed him a number of times. He's a friend of mine. He wrote, this is one of the many books that he wrote, The African Presence in Early Europe, which deals with the history of the Moors in Europe, the African presence in early Europe. But from Runoko, I developed the phrase, what you do for yourself, what you do to yourself, what you allow other people to do to you and get away with is based upon what you think about yourself, etc. So I got the base from Runoko and modified that, okay, and made it my own. Let's see here. This is some stuff we show in the class. Richard Pryor, we have Malcolm X. The media is the most powerful entity on earth. They have the power to make the innocent guilty and the guilty innocent. And that's power because they control the minds of the masses. Okay, I'm trying to go past some of this. Okay, excuse me. So this is Dr. David Imhotep, who wrote the book, The First Americans Were Africans, Documented Evidence. On page 14 of his book, he deals with the African presence in this country going back at least 51,700 years. Now, this was a discovery made by Dr. Albert Goodyear, who was an archaeologist from the University of South Carolina. This discovery was in 2004. This is what Dr. Albert Goodyear found in Allendale County, South Carolina, 13 different pieces of evidence documenting an African presence in this country going back at least 51,700 years ago. They found artifacts, architecture, campsites, carvings, Egyptian writings, footprints in lava, genetic M174D haploid groups dealing with DNA and genetics, linguistics, paintings, skulls, skeleton structures, and tools. 13 different disciplines thoroughly documented an African presence in this country going back at least 51,700 years ago. His book has 713 footnotes. And his new book comes out should be July 2019, because I talked to him about 3 or 4 weeks ago. And his new book, because his current book is out of print, but his new book is The First Americans Were Africans Revisited, has about 200 additional pages of research, new archaeological discoveries, so that comes out July 2019. Here's Dr. Albert Goodyear. Now, this is an article from ScienceDaily.com, which is a scientific journal, scientific website, ScienceDaily.com, from November 18th, 2004, 15 years ago. Name of this article is New Evidence Puts Man in North America 50,000 Years Ago. It's about Dr. Albert Goodyear's discovery. Here is a summary from ScienceDaily.com about the article and about his discovery. It says radiocarbon tests of carbonized plant remains, where artifacts were unearthed last May along the Savannah River in Allendale County by University of South Carolina archaeologist Dr. Albert Goodyear, indicate that the sediments containing these artifacts are at least 50,000 years old, meaning that humans inhabited North America long before the last ice age. Now, this is not me saying this. This is not Dr. Yosef Ben Yakinen, Professor Kaba Khamenei, Dr. David Imhotep, Professor James Small. This is not us saying this. This is what ScienceDaily.com is saying about Dr. Albert Goodyear's archaeological discovery. Now, most cities I lecture and ask people about this, they're not familiar with this, haven't read that article. So we talk about different archaeological discoveries. This is one about the lost city of Egypt. This article is from April 30th, 2013 from news.yahoo.com, dealing with the sunken Egyptian city reveals 1,200-year-old secrets. So this city was swallowed into the sea about 1,200 years ago. The lost city of Egypt called Tanis Heraklion. The discovery of this lost city was made in the year 2000. They excavated it for about 12, 13 years, and they revealed their findings in around April 2013. Okay, so they found 150 feet beneath the surface of Egypt's Bay of Abu Qir. They found 64 ships, 16-foot tall statues, 700 acres, countless gold coins, and smaller artifacts. Archaeologist Frank Gaudillo, who is the lead archaeologist on this expedition, estimates that Tanis Heraklion was built around 8th century BC. This is a lost city. Okay, I mean, this is just one of the archaeological discoveries that we deal with in the course. Here's some pictures of what they found. 16-foot tall statues coming straight out of ancient Kemet. Okay, this is one of Offset, who the Greeks call Isis, that they found. There's another one, the bottom legs of a statue. This is probably from Offset. The headdress of Offset has the horns of Het Heru or Hathor, the sun disk of Ra. All this stuff is just found it. All right. Let's see, let's fast forward. Dr. Clark taught us all history is a current event. Everything that's ever happened continues to happen in some shape, form, or fashion. Dr. Wade Nobles taught us power is the ability to define and shape reality. Have other people accept your definition of reality as if it were their own. So we deal with the 800-year occupation of Europe by the Africans known as the Moors. One of the sources in the course we use is a bunch of books here. Just give me a minute. Golden Age of the Moor, edited by Dr. Ivan Van Sertima, is one of the best books dealing with the history of the Moors in medieval times. Golden Age of the Moor, edited by Dr. Ivan Van Sertima. Okay. And then let's put that over there. Then we use Renoco's book also. The African Presence in Early Europe, use this as well. Excellent book. Excellent book. Okay. And Renoco was a student and friend of Dr. Ivan Van Sertima. Dr. Ivan Van Sertima is an ancestor now. So to understand how we got into this predicament, we have to understand 1492, January 2nd, 1492. We know that the Moors lose control of their last stronghold of Granada in Spain. August 3rd, 1492, Columbus set sail on the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. And we see that when we connect the teachings that the Moors take into Europe, and this ties into the book Stolen Legacy, another book we use in the course. Stolen Legacy by George G.M. James. Greek philosophy is stolen Egyptian philosophy, okay? And we get a close-up of this. Ties right into this, and George G.M. James in the books talks about how the Moors were the custodians of the ancient Egyptian mystery system, okay? And the Moors are taking these teachings into Europe, bringing Europe out of the Dark Ages. And because of all this stuff that happens and what they taught the Europeans, I say, I wish we had never taught them. It's not that I'm wishing harm on anybody, but I'm looking at the repercussions and the harm that is brought upon us. This is why I say I wish we had never taught them. But the Moors are going to teach this to a group that are formed in during the Second Crusade, 1118 AD, known as the Poor Knights of Christ. They're going to become known as the Knights Templar, okay? And the Knights Templar become very powerful. They're very knowledgeable. They're dealing with science and math, things like this. Now, at the time the Moors go in 711 AD, about 90% of Europeans are illiterate, okay? You had kings and queens who were illiterate. They could neither read nor write. So the Moors are introducing spherical globes, almanacs. They introduced something called alchemy, which today we call chemistry. They introduced the periodic tables. They're introducing literature, all this stuff into Europe. Okay, different types of foods, musical instruments, surgery techniques, medical treaties, all this stuff. Europe was in the Dark Ages at this time. Okay, a time of ignorance, and it's going to be the knowledge from the Moors that bring Europe out of the Dark Ages. And then the next age is going to be called the Renaissance age, which was the age of enlightenment, light associated with knowledge. But George G.M. James talks about how the Moors were the custodians of the ancient Egyptian mystery systems. The Knights Templar get a watered down version of these teachings. And then when the Knights Templar we have one group that's rounded up in October 13th, 1307 in France. And eventually they're all going to be disbanded. But this was said to be the day the knowledge stopped, October 13th, which is a Friday, 1307 in France. This was said to be the day the knowledge stopped. And this is one of the reasons why Friday the 13th is looked at as an unlucky number. The fear of Friday the 13th is called frigatriskaidekaphobia, okay? Frigatriskaidekaphobia. And don't I have that? Yeah, this slide right here. You'll see at the bottom. So we see the Druids. The Druids also. This ties into the history of St. Patrick and the Eastern Orthodox Church. Pope Celestine I sending a British slave named Patrick into Ireland in 432 AD to convert the Irish to Christianity. Now, this is before the Catholic Church. This is not the Catholic Church. Catholic Church does not come into existence until mid-11th century AD. At this time, it's the Eastern Orthodox Church. You have the Druids. Druid in Old Irish means he who knows. These are all some of the things we do with the online course. It's just giving you an overview. Okay, it's just a preview. This is just skimming the tip of the iceberg. Excuse me. All right, let's continue. So Druid, the word Druid in Old Irish means he who knows. And the Druids, they were dealing with the gnosis, which means true knowledge. They're dealing with a watered down version of teachings coming from ancient Kemet or ancient Egypt. These teachings, this may go outside the circumference of some people's awareness. Just because you never heard it before, don't like it, or disagree with it does not mean it's not true. It just means you have to do some research to understand what I'm talking about. Okay? And Dr. Ray Higgins was one of my teachers as well. I mean, people have heard the interviews I've done with Dr. Ray Higgins, the African Village in Atlanta. Being I'm in Atlanta, I need to go visit the African Village too, by the way. All right, just side note. But what the Druids were studying and teaching conflicted with the Christian church. Okay, so when you have the British slave named Patrick, when he's going in, he's killing Druids who were known as the snake people because they wore a helmet with the uraeus, a cobra on it, which was a snake. So when we read about Patrick or Saint Patrick, and some people honor his feast day because he died about 1462 AD on March 17th. That's his feast day. That's the day he died. When they talk about Patrick running the snakes out of Ireland, when you study the history of Ireland, and I had to study the history of Ireland to do presentations dealing with the origins of St. Patrick's Day. There's no evidence of snakes being in Ireland because Ireland is an island. One, it's a cold climate. Two, so snakes, if you know anything about snakes, they have to live in warmer climates. There's no evidence of snakes being in Ireland. So when they talk about Patrick running the snakes out of Ireland, they're talking about the not snakes that crawled on the ground, but the two-legged snakes, or the snake people called Druids, who had a helmet with the uraeus on it. Okay, some people say that he ran quote unquote paganism out of Ireland, referring to the Druids. Okay, but this is what it's dealing with. If you read Now Valid Contributions to Civilization by Tony Browder, pages 193 to 194, which is one of the books we use in the course also. Browder, who's a friend of mine, I've interviewed him a number of times. Browder talks about this history also. Okay, Now Valley, hold on, it's further in the stack, further down in the stack. Now Valley Contributions to Civilization by Tony Browder. I've had this book over 20 years. Okay, this is an excellent, excellent book. But when we talk about frigatriskaidekaphobia, Browder was the first person, I heard use that term. And I've done research on I actually did a show some years ago. Episode of my show, the African History Network show, is archived. You can go back and listen to it. Go to AfricanHistoryNetwork.com, and on the homepage, click on Listen to Podcast. I did a show dealing with the history of Friday the 13th, and why is 13 an unlucky number, and Friday the 13th. Frigatriskaidekaphobia deals with the fear of the number, deals with the fear of Friday the 13th specifically. Triskaidekaphobia is the fear of the number 13. Frigatriskaidekaphobia is the fear of Friday the 13th. Frigga, coming from Freya, Frigga, who was the wife of Odin in Scandinavian mythology. We know Odin was the father of Thor, And when we study the origins of the days of the week, the names of the days of the week, it ties a lot of that ties back into Scandinavian mythology. So Friday is named after Freya or Frigga, who was the wife of Odin. Okay, this is some deep history. All this stuff is interconnected, interrelated. All right, so, like I said, this is some of the stuff we dealt with in the class. I'm just giving you an overview. This is why it's 8 weeks, 16 hours, because it's so much. So when we look at something like this, right, we deal with Egypt of the West, and we deal with this land being Egypt of the West. We're dealing with the layout of Washington, D.C., based upon ancient African principles and based upon the layout of ancient Kemet, ancient Egypt. And we deal with the symbolism. So the teachings that the Moors take into Europe are taught to the Knights Templar, formed in 1118 AD during the Second Crusade. When they're disbanded, those teachings go underground and resurface as the Scottish rites of the Freemasons, Yorkshire rites as the Freemasons, the Rosicrucians, things like this, these various, what people call secret societies or societies with secrets. And then they come to Jamestown, Virginia with the founding fathers. 50 of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence were Freemasons. I'm going to get into Freemasonry here in just a minute. So when we look at this, the Washington Monument, right, behind the monument of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the MLK Monument. Washington Monument is 555 feet tall. That is a tekken. A tekken is an ancient African symbol. There were about 1,200 tekkenu for plural, all throughout ancient Kemet. It's a symbol of resurrection, transformation, coming from the mythology of Asar, Aset, and Heru. Okay? There's a deep story behind that. Who the Greeks called Osiris, Isis, and Horus. And this was the first Holy Trinity also, Aset, or Isis, giving birth to the baby Heru, or Horus, through a virgin birth, immaculate conception, all this stuff. We get deep into this, okay? I'm just trying to cut it short here. But so we see the symbolism here, okay? And the 50 of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence were Freemasons. So when we look at the word Mason, the word Mason is derived from the Latin words mass and sun. Mason means child of light and expresses the desire to pursue light, which is a metaphor for the sun, which symbolizes knowledge. So for eons, light has been associated with knowledge, darkness associated with ignorance, okay? If you see a cartoon and a cartoon character gets a bright idea, a light bulb goes off above the little cartoon character's head, right? Whether it's Dora the Explorer or Doc McStuffins or, Tom and Jerry, whatever, Mickey Mouse, okay? And even associating bright with idea deals with light, okay? And if you have a child who is said to be not smart or dumb, or whatever word you use, you may say this is a dim-witted child, D-I-M, lack of light. When we deal with Europe in the Dark Ages, this is a period of ignorance, while West Africa is thriving. West Africa is not in a period of Dark Ages. Now, Northern Africa is invaded, East Africa, they're invaded by Arabs, okay? The Arab slave trade of African people is well underway. That goes back hundreds of years before the transatlantic slave trade starts. But West Africa, Ghana, Songhai, Mali, these West African nations are thriving, okay? And, one gives birth to the other. But West Africa is is not in the Dark Ages. Europe is in the Dark Ages, and it's going to be Africans, the Moors, who take the light from ancient Kemet, ancient Egypt, take the knowledge, the light, into Europe and bring Europe out of the Dark Ages. Now, the term child of light, or sons and daughters of light, was first used to identify students who had completed 42 years of study in the temples of ancient Kemet. Many Masonic temples were modeled, Masonic, referring to Masons. Many Masonic temples were modeled after the temples of ancient Kemet, places where light or knowledge was imparted in a series of steps or degrees, okay? So when we deal with the whole concept of liberal art colleges, all right, and George G.M. James deals with this in Stolen Legacy. When we deal with the whole concept of liberal art colleges and the 7 liberal arts, the trivium and the quadrivium, the 3 and the 4. This goes back to ancient Kemet. This goes back to ancient Egypt. And you get in your credentials in a series of degrees. So you go to college, you get your associate's degree, bachelor's degree, master's degree, PhD. Okay, this is where this comes from. Now in Masonry, the highest degree in Masonry you could get is 33-degree Mason. So when you understand that these Greeks and Romans learned from ancient Africans, they learned less than 10% of what the ancient Africans knew and were teaching. So 10% of 360, which is total knowledge, 100%. 10% is 36. Europeans learn less than 10%. So when we look at Freemasonry, 33 degrees is the highest. Is less than 10%. Is less than 36. Read Browder's book, another book by Browder, Egypt on the Potomac. Egypt on the Potomac by Tony Browder. It's about 70 pages. The book will blow you away because this book deals with how the whole layout of Washington, D.C. is based upon, is a copy of ancient Egypt and is based upon ancient African principles. And we know Benjamin Banneker was the surveyor and did the layout of Washington, D.C. And he was a master astronomer, descendants of the Dogon, from what we know. And the Dogon were master astronomers. The Dogon are in Mali and Burkina Faso, but they come from ancient Kemet. They migrate to Mali and Burkina Faso, but they're in ancient Egypt. They're in the Nile Valley region. This is a deep history. So this is why the way I teach the transatlantic slave trade, the history of it is different. You got to deal with thousands of years of history, man. You got to deal with history leading up to this. We have to deal with this history chronologically. So 50 of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence, which is signed in 1776, July 4th, 1776, you had about 4 signers. The other 52 signers signed it on August 2nd, okay? Majority of them did not sign it on July 4th, 1776. Most of them signed it August 2nd, 1776. 13 of the 39 signers of the U.S. Constitution were Freemasons as well, okay? So here's a picture of Osar, Auset, and Heru, who the Greeks called Osiris, Isis, and Horus. Asar, or Osiris, is in the middle. All right, and then we see the co-option, the cultural appropriation of the African woman from Auset, who the Greeks called Isis, to the 1970s TV series that came on Saturday mornings on CBS, the Shazam and Isis Hour, and they showed the secrets of Isis. So they showed this white woman. They said she got her powers from ancient Egypt. On Hulu, the streaming service Hulu, they had a couple of years ago, I don't have Hulu anymore because I ain't watch it that much. But I know a couple of years ago, they had episodes of this show, and I watched it. The Secrets of Isis, they may still have it. And at the beginning of it, when the show comes on, they talk about how she gets her powers from ancient Egypt. And they start talking about the daughters of Hathor and all this stuff. This is still in our culture. They don't say these were African people. They don't say this white woman is a copy of an African woman. Even though we're dealing with mythology, it's just straight up theft. So this picture here is from the complete series, the box set DVD series, The Secrets of Isis. If you decide that you want to get the full series on DVD, it's available. Okay, don't know why you would want it, but anyway. So from Auset and Heru, who the Greeks called Osiris, who the Greeks called Isis and Horus, we get the Black Madonna and Child, who is worshipped all throughout Europe. There are statues of the Black Madonna and Child that still exist now. They're in Paris, France. They're in Poland. They have them in Germany, there's statues of the Black Madonna and Child still throughout Europe. They were worshiping the African woman in Europe. And see, this is why you have to deal with this history before you deal with the transatlantic slave trade. Because you have to ask the question, wait a second, how did it go from worshiping the African woman to enslaving the African woman and making her a wet nurse? How the hell did that happen? And this stuff gets turned around with the Africans we know as Moors. These fights between the Africans and the Europeans. This is where this stuff gets switched around. And the transatlantic slave trade is a continuation of that. It's not the beginning, it's a continuation. The transatlantic slave trade, when you actually understand a chronology of history, it's Europeans getting revenge on the African Moors and on African people in general. And one of the things the Moors were doing, especially Moorish men, is they were intermixing with the European population. They were having relations with white women, okay? And the history of the Moors is not just in the architecture in Europe, it's not just in the literature, like Othello, okay? And in Hidden Colors too, you know, when Runoko Rashidi is interviewed, he talks about how in literature, they refer to the Moors as being, you know, black as ink, black as night, black as a crow, you know, nothing white about them but their teeth, okay? You see the Moors in literature, but you also see the Moors, the presence of the Moors in the European bloodline. Because the Moors were changing the complexion of these European populations they're going into. And Spain and Portugal probably gets it the most, because Spain and Portugal is right above Morocco. England, Austria, and Germany are further away, so they get it to a lesser extent. But, you know, historically, the Spanish and the Portuguese, they were a darker complexion than the English and the Austrians and the Germans in general. In general, they were dark in complexion. We see it also in Sicily. We see them changing the complexion in Sicily, because the Moors were in Sicily as well. We see it in Italy. The Moors were in Italy also. So this is a deep history. So when you have someone like Queen Charlotte Sophia, or Queen Sophia Charlotte, who was the wife of King George III during the American Revolutionary War, and she's of African ancestry, Moorish African ancestry on her mother's side. This is King George III, who the 13 colonies are at war against, separating from. And his wife is of African ancestry. She's the queen of Great Britain. And when you study her, it talks about her Moorish ancestry on her mother's side. So there's a deep history and deep evidence of the Moors all throughout Europe, including in the bloodline, but also in the language and the names as well. We'll be getting to that in the course, because I'm about to wrap up here. All right. But let me see something here. I got all these books. Hold on. Just a second. And here's a book not enough people talk about. This is one of the 5 books Dr. King wrote. Please read Dr. King's books. Where do we go from here? Chaos or Community. This is the last book I hear. When I go to Dr. King Day celebration, some of the saddest things I've ever seen in my life, because I see people talking about Dr. King. I could tell they never studied Dr. King at all, never read any of his books. That's probably his most important book, his last book, written in 1967. Where do we go from here? Chaos or Community. So this is Black Star, the African Presence in Early Europe. One of the books we use in the course. This is a source. You don't have to buy it. This is from Runoko Rashidi, but I'm sure if you go to drrunoko.com, I'm sure he appreciates you buying his books. I do encourage you to buy his books, but you don't have to, just, start the course. Here's some of the images of the Black Madonna and Child. Some of the statues over here, some of the statues of the Black Madonna and Child, okay? This is from page 90, all right? We see it in Switzerland, we see it in Poland, Madrid, Spain. Some of you have been to Spain, you've seen it, okay? Luxembourg City, Luxembourg. That stuff still exists today. They used to worship the African woman. What happened? Okay, so let's go back to this here. And I'll post a link again in just a minute here. How's everybody doing? How y'all like this type of information? We got Quentin watching, Motor City Eric, got Jay, just a few of the people, Toya. How y'all like this type of information? If you want me to post a link again to the online course you can register for, we'll do that also. So from Osset and Heru, okay, the first Holy Trinity, for Heru, born of an Immaculate Conception, December 25th. Long story there, don't want time to get into it. You get the Black Madonna and Child worship all throughout Europe. Then from that, you get the decolorized version. This may go outside the circumference of some people's awareness, but Europeans used to worship a Black Jesus, okay, the Black Madonna and Child. And just for the sake of, to be historically accurate, right? The letter J was not invented until 1630 AD. So his name could not have been Jesus. In the story, his mama didn't call him Jesus, it was Yeshua. The letter J, if you read, excuse me, if you read the historical origins of Christianity by Dr. Walter Williams, who's a friend of mine, one of my teachers as well. And the book is in the other stack, because I got 2 other stacks behind the desk, or 3 other stacks of books behind the desk. So that book I don't think is here. The Historical Origins of Christianity by Dr. Walter Williams. Chapter 9 deals with the whole history of the letter J. The letter J was not invented until 1630 AD. The letter J is derived from the letter I. The letter J is an I with a hook on it. So one of the mistakes that we make is thinking that the way things are today is the way they've always been. That's not true. This is why you have to deal with a chronology of things. So if you go to the dictionary and look up the word Jesus, okay, it's going to take you, it deals with the etymology. It'll take you to the Greek Iesus, okay? Okay, I think it's I-E-S-U-S. It'll take you to the Greek Iesus. And let's see, it takes you to the Latin and the Greek. It takes you to Iesus and I-E-S-U-S, something like that. Then it takes you back to Yeshua, which is Hebrew. Okay, it takes you back to Yeshua. The letter J, so his mama didn't call him Jesus. It'd be impossible. So as you have a rise in the European phenotype, okay, as you have a rise in the European phenotype, you have a rise, as you have a rise in European powers coming out of the Dark Ages, conquering other people's lands, extracting the mineral wealth, enslaving people, creating plantations, using this mineral wealth to build up Europe, which was coming out of the Dark Ages. Europe had lost 1/4 to 1/3 of their population. The bubonic plague hit in 1347 AD and hits in spurts from 1347 to 1400. Europe, as Dr. John Henrik Clarke says, was land poor, people poor, and resource poor. As you have a rise in European powers, you have a rise in the European phenotype, and you have a rise in the dominance of European features, etc. And these traditionally African images get reinterpreted as European. So Hercules was originally Black. Zeus was originally Black. Okay, the Black Madonna and Child was originally Black, not because it was dirty because of smoke, because they were worshiping the African woman. This gets all reinterpreted as European. As Africans are conquered and enslaved, you have a dominance of the Europeans, power structure, You have a dominance in their phenotype. So Michelangelo paints the Sistine Chapel, okay, using his relatives, his aunts and uncles, things like this, as the model for Adam and Eve and for God, and it's all being depicted as Europeans. Okay, so we do a why Christmas, December is on why Christmas is on December 25th. We talked some about Dr. Francis Cress Welsing and Lily Fuller, who basically told us if you don't understand European white supremacy, racism, what it is and how it works, everything else that you think you understand will only confuse you. This is Dr. Welsing, who I interviewed 3 times. You can listen to those podcasts also at AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. She wrote the ISIS papers, The Keys to the Colors. One of my teachers, Dr. Leonard Jeffries, Dr. J and Professor Jane Small, when they teach, if you heard any of my interviews with them, you hear them talk about the pyramid principle. So this is the pyramid of Khafre at Giza. The foundation of the pyramid is African history and culture. It's our history and culture that gives us our values, our interests, and our principles, our VIPs, our values, our interests, and our principles. This gives us the cultural framework that we see reality through. This, our self-esteem, our self-worth, our self-value is tied to what we know about ourselves, what we've been taught about ourselves. Our VIPs, our values, our interests, and our principles, okay? This influences our economic empowerment and our political empowerment. It influences what type of businesses we have, who we spend our money with, okay? Are we breaking down white people's doors to give our money to them on Black Friday? That don't even make sense. On Black Friday, you're gonna give your money to white businesses? Stand outside 3, 4 o'clock in the morning at the Best Buy and Target, all this stuff on Black Friday? Shouldn't we make that Black Empowerment Friday and redirect those dollars to African-American owned businesses? I'm not saying spend money on things you don't need, but you know, if you're gonna spend some money, shouldn't you redirect on Black Friday? It ain't White Friday, it's Black Friday. Shouldn't you? I mean, Black people are trained to go to white corporations, white businesses, stand outside in the line, camp out overnight, and give their money away day after Thanksgiving. I understand the marketing. My degree's in marketing. I understand the programming. I'm saying we have to deprogram. Says nobody. I'm somebody that understands the programming more than most people because I was trained in the program. Okay, I'm saying we have to deprogram ourselves from the program. So the history and culture influences your economic empowerment, influences the type of businesses you have, who you spend your dollars with, who you spend the majority of your dollars with. I know we're still going to spend a percentage of our dollars with, you know, white-owned businesses, but spending about 95% of our businesses with white-owned companies, that doesn't even make sense. It influences the structure of your economic empowerment. Is it largely based upon white European capitalism, or is it based upon the cooperatives, the co-ops? Okay, let me show you this book here. So this is Collective Courage, a history of African-American cooperative economic thought and practice. This deals with a history of African-American economic empowerment through the co-ops, which is really an African principle, the cooperatives, an African principle that we brought with us largely from West Africa here. So this is a book by Dr. Jessica Gordon-Nimhard. So I interviewed her back in about 2012 or so. A few years ago, I interviewed Dr. Jessica Gordon-Nimhard, 2012, 2014. The interview is podcasted. And her book documents numerous dozens and dozens of examples of African-American co-ops, even going back into slavery. So we're having benevolent societies that are organizing and raising money so African Americans can buy themselves out of slavery and buy loved ones out of slavery. We have the Free African Society, 1757, which is a benevolent society. You're going to have all different types of co-ops that we have. The Colored Farmers Union Association that's founded around 1886 or so in Texas, and it's going to grow to somewhere around 1.2 million. Some people even say more. Okay, people. We have a history of economic empowerment through the co-ops, not through white European capitalism. Okay, now I'm not attacking. Let me phrase this properly. Those of African American scholars that promote investing in the white stock market, things like this. This is not an attack on them. My degree is in business administration. Okay, so that's what I was taught in school. When I was taking my business classes at Wayne State University in Detroit, I only had in the business school, I think I only had 3 professors of African descent. One I ended up working for, lifelong friend. The other was from Ghana. The other brother taught accounting. Everybody else was white. And I had one Turkish professor who taught international business. And in my production management course, that was taught by an Indian guy. Okay, but largely a history of African American cooperative economics, dealing with the co-ops. We were not taught that. We were taught white business principles. Okay, so what happened is that over the years, going into the 40s, 50s, even 30s some, but especially going to the 60s, 70s, 80s, etc. African Americans went to white business schools, or they went to business schools with either white professors or African Americans who were taught white business principles. Could be at an HBCU, not knocking HBCUs, we need them, but just follow. So what happened was you had a lot of African Americans who got business degrees, went to white business schools or black white business schools, learned white business principles, white capitalism, brought that back to the African American community to implement that. That largely does not work for the collective. It can benefit individuals. It largely does not work for the collective. And then this history that Dr. Jessica Gordon Nemhard breaks down here was largely forgotten. Now we start having, and see what happened was co-ops became associated with white hippies. So co-ops was something that poor white people did or white hippies did. No, these are principles that we brought with us from Africa. When we look at West Africans, they have the Susu system, S-U-S-U, the Susu system, which is a investment type of system that they use to fund businesses. These are principles that we used to operate based upon. So we have to reclaim this. So your history and culture gives you your values, your interests, and your principles. It influences your economic empowerment, but the type of economic empowerment that you have. Okay, I'm all for investing and having 401ks, things like this, right? And what I explain to some of our brothers and sisters who talk about investing, things like this, I'm all for that. I've owned stocks in the past. I'll own them again. I've invested in Bitcoin. I got out before the bottom dropped out of Bitcoin. It goes up and down some. It ain't nothing like it used to be before they came out with Bitcoin futures. Okay, because I remember when Bitcoin touched for a second like 20,000. All right. Economic empowerment and wealth creation are not the same thing. We need both of them. Wealth creation, wealth is basically assets minus liabilities. Okay. We can all have stock portfolios valued at $5 million. And we can still spend 97% of our dollars with people that don't look like us. You've accumulated wealth. Economic empowerment comes when we transform that wealth into buying the land in our community so we can start gentrification, by owning the grocery stores, the gas stations, the radio stations, the TV stations, things like this, the car washes, owning the businesses in our community, buying up the office buildings, buying up the multi-story buildings, buying up the apartment buildings. That's economic empowerment. So I'm all for, we can use the stock market to gain capital, to gain wealth that we can use to transform into economic empowerment. But wealth creation and economic empowerment are not the same thing. We have to make a clear distinction between the two of them. The reason why is because if you are confused about your destination, your goal, then you won't know how to properly get there. So you accumulate wealth and think you arrived, but don't realize you're still giving 97% of your dollars to people that don't look like you. You're still financing your own dehumanization. You're still financing your own gentrification. And you've created wealth largely invested in white people's corporations, financing white folks' dreams. It can be used as a tool. I'm not against it being used as a tool. Don't get me wrong. Okay? Please don't misunderstand what I'm saying. It can be used as a tool, a bridge to get to the destination, but it's not a destination. What's a bridge? A bridge is an apparatus that you use to get from one point to the next point. A bridge is not the destination. A bridge is an apparatus that you cross to get to the destination. Okay? So the stock market, investments, forex, foreign exchange, all that, I'm for all that. It can be used as a tool to get to the destination of economic empowerment. Okay? But we can't confuse that with economic empowerment. Those are two entirely different things. All right, let's continue. In 401ks, IRA, I'm for all that. Okay, don't get me wrong. Now, what we have to understand is that when we use those, we don't want to finance our own dehumanization. What do I mean by that? A lot of people are invested in privatized prisons through their pension funds and 401k plans and don't know it. So I'm all for 401k plans. I'm not saying don't get rid of them. I'm saying call your benefits manager and find out what industries and businesses you are invested in, because you can choose, you can divest from certain industries or businesses and invest in others. In June of 2017, in New York, in the city of New York, you had city employees of the city of New York who found out that they were invested in privatized prisons. Their pension funds, part of their pension funds were invested in privatized prisons. They divested $48 million from their pension funds from privatized prisons. Core Civic, which is the largest owner-operator of privatized prisons, used to be called Corrections Corporation of America. And also another one called G4S, and then also, let's see, Core Civics and Geo Group, okay? Geo Group used to be Wackenhut. There was an article from New York Daily News about this. We'll try to, yeah, here we go. Because I have thousands of articles bookmarked. Luckily, I remembered the key word for this one, so we can pull it up. NYC Pension Fund to back out of investments in private prisons. This is from June 8th, 2017, New York Daily News. This is something that actually happened. And on Politics Nation, on Reverend Al Sharpton's show, is shown on MSNBC, he interviewed somebody involved in this after it happened. This actually happened. These people divested $48 million in pension fund dollars from privatized prisons. So they say, you may have privatized prisons, but you ain't gonna do it with our money. So even in these investments, we have to understand we can't finance our own dehumanization and finance our own gentrification. So through the National Action Network, they have an initiative for 2019. Reverend Al Sharpton's talked about it on his radio show, Keeping It Real, how part of their economic agenda is to understand how they are financing their own gentrification through pension funds and divest from those companies that take pension fund dollars and loan it to business developers who then take that money and then gentrify Black people's communities. Well, they're using your pension fund dollars to largely do that. Okay, so they're showing them ways to divest from these companies that are then loaning the money to developers to then gentrify their own communities. We're financing a lot of our own dehumanization and don't know this. Okay, let's continue here. Okay, and then so we have economic empowerment, and the other side of the pyramid is political empowerment. Okay, and we understand politics is the legal distribution of scarce wealth, power, and resources, and the writing of laws, statutes, ordinances, amendments, and treaties, the adoption, interpretation, and enforcement. People who don't care about themselves largely don't care about voting because they don't care what happens to themselves. What you do for yourself, what you do to yourself, what you allow other people to do to you and get away with is based upon what you think about yourself. Your economics ties into the politics. Okay, so we need all three. It's not just economic empowerment. Some people just focus on economic empowerment. Now, the foundation is African history and culture. If that foundation is not in place, then you'll continue to use 97%, take 97% of your dollars and spend them with people that don't look like you. Okay, if that foundation is not in place. All right, so we posted that article for you all. Okay, so these are, let's see. And this is Dr. Jeffries. He says, whoever controls the images controls your self-esteem, self-respect, and self-development. Whoever controls the history controls the vision. Absolutely, Ashe. So we'll deal with Origins of the Word America. This is Professor Kabahai Wapa Kamene. You see him in the Hidden Colors documentaries. We're in the Black Friday documentaries together from director Rick Mathis. We're in the Elementary Genocide 3 documentary from director Raheem Shabazz. We deal with the Origins of the Word America. And in the 1828 Noah Webster edition, Noah Webster Dictionary, 1828 edition, when you it's online. When you look at the word American, right, it clearly tells you that the word American originally applied to the Aboriginals or copper colored races found in the Americas by Europeans. Well, hold on. You mean the word American didn't originally apply to white people? Well, who were the Aboriginal copper colored races? Who was in the Americas when white people got there? It was African people and Native Americans. But now applies to the descendants of Europeans born in America. So we go back to Dr. David Imhotep's book. The first Americans were Africans. Yes, we were. African people are the original Americans. African people are the original Americans. Okay. So these are some of the things we deal with. And this deals with, this ties into the history of the Moors. So I saw this first in Runoko Rashidi's book, Black Star, the African Presence in Early Europe, right? And this is a book on the Great Migration. I forgot I was going through another bookshelf and saw this. I forgot I had this book, The Great Migration and Historical Perspective, New Dimensions of Race, Class, and Gender by Joe Williams Trotter Jr. I forgot. I was going through, I got a whole nother separate bookshelf in a cabinet, and I was putting some books in there, and I forgot I had that book. But let's see here. So this right here, right? Page, go to drronoko.com. You get information on ordering Runoko's books, Runoko Rashidi. Page 91. The flag of Sardinia, Italy, with 4 Moors heads on it. Okay. So I was preparing for an interview I was doing with Runoko a few years ago about this book. Book had just come out. And I saw this in the book. I was reading through it. So you have this flag of Sardinia with 4 Moors heads on it. So I started doing research, okay? And based upon my research, I incorporated that into some of my presentations I do. And we deal with this in the class. This once again deals with the African presence and this deals with the presence of the Moors. Okay, so we have Moors heads on flags in Corsica and Sardinia. So with the blue background, you have the flag, the national flag of Corsica, which is a French island in the Mediterranean. And the other one with the 4 Moors heads on it, these are African men. You have the national flag of Sardinia, which is an Italian island in the Mediterranean. Okay, so I was doing research on this, and the Moors were in these areas. It took a monumental effort to conquer them. Okay, so we see that they have bandanas on, headbands, bandanas. Originally, the bandanas were blindfolds to symbolize that they were prisoners that had been conquered. But because of being politically correct, because of tourism, things like this, the blindfolds were changed to bandanas, but they're still on the flags. Okay, so what happened was I was doing research on these flags, and at the time, so these pictures come from Wikipedia. Our history is there. You have certain people who know our history, They just won't come out and say, oh, these were black men, these were African men, they came from here, they came from there. You know, so they'll use the word Moor, but won't actually tell you who the Moors were. I was watching the History Channel a few years ago. Their multi-part series dealing with the barbarians, okay? And each installment they dealt with like the Alans, the Picts, the Vandals, the Visigoths, the Anglos, the Saxons, the Lombards, the Jutes, these collectively called barbarians, also called Germanic people. But there was one episode and they show the Moors going into the Iberian Peninsula, today Spain and Portugal. Back then it was the Iberian Peninsula, 711 AD. And they show them as like Arabs riding in on horseback. They didn't say that these were African people. Okay, now there were Arabs with them, but they just depict them as Arabs. Don't say these are African people. And even the term Arab is a tricky term because Arab is a culture. When we think of Arab, we think of like white Arabs. Arab is a culture. You know, the old saying was to be Arab, you had to have some African blood, because even today in Sudan, you have, well, you have North Sudan and you have Sudan, if I remember correctly, is separated. You have black Arabs there. But even when you study the original Arabs were African. The Arab is a culture, is not a race. Okay. You have white Arabs. And a lot of times when we think of Arabs, we think of the lighter skinned Arabs. Okay, those who are in control in like North Africa. But the original Arabs were Africans. And you still have African Arabs today. Arab is a culture. But they show these Moors as not being black Africans. And this is a way to obfuscate, as Dr. Jose Clemente Bay would say, to obfuscate the history, to distort it. He has an essay in this book as well. This is one of the best books dealing with the history of the Moors, Golden Age of the Moor. He has an essay in here. Dr. Jose Clemente Bay is one of the baddest scholars on the history of the Moors. I interviewed him years ago. And he did he used to teach classes on the history of the Moors at Temple University, where Dr. Malefa Kete Asante is. And at last I heard, he was at Berea College in Kentucky. All right, so yeah, so we have this here. This is more evidence of the history of the Moors in Europe, okay? But this ties into our history. All right, so we deal with Columbus. And Columbus, when he set sail on his 4 voyages, starting August 3rd, 1492, on the Nina, the Pinta, and Santa Maria, Columbus never comes to this land we call the United States of America. The closest he comes here is Cuba, which is 90 miles away. So we need to stop saying he discovered America. One, there were already people there. 70% of the people Columbus encounters are African people, okay? Dr. David Imhotep deals with this in his book, The First Americans Were Africans, Documented Evidence. 70% of the people Columbus encounters in the islands are still African people. 1. 2, Columbus never comes to the land we call the United States of America, these 48 contiguous states, because it's not Atlanta, Alaska and Hawaii are not connected to this landmass. We talk about the 48 contiguous states, contiguous meaning connected. The closest he comes here is Cuba, which is 90 miles away. All right, there's Dr. David Imhotep. You got Hannibal Barca, the Battle of Canaan, 216 BC. So we deal with, the transatlantic slave trade. We deal with what Henry Louis Gates Jr. gets wrong about the African involvement in slavery, life insurance companies, all things like this. Okay, these things I talked about. Modern gynecology, Ghana, Songhai, and Mali, the 3 great West African countries as well, African empires. And we see that is so you have 3 great Moorish dynasties, the Almohads, the Almoravids, and the Umayyad dynasties. We see the Almoravids, who were largely these very religious zealots. They're going to invade Ghana in 11th century AD, which leads to the fall of Ghana. So this is a deep history. Okay, read Classical Africa by Dr. Malefi Kete Asante. And like I said, we deal with the fake Willie Lynch letter 1712. So these are just a few things that we deal with. The Willie Lynch never historically existed. For those who keep talking about Willie Lynch syndrome, all that, throw that stuff in the garbage can. Willie Lynch never historically existed. The letter has been proven to be a fraud. Their words in the Willie Lynch letter didn't even exist in the early 18th century. And if you understand the structure of language amongst the British, they didn't even talk like that. That letter was written about 1970 by Dr. Kwabena Ashanti. And there's a video of, he's come out and admitted he wrote the Willie Lynch letter. He was trying to show African Americans how they act like slaves. That means throw that damn thing in the garbage can. He meant well. This is not an attack. He meant well. But we don't understand history. Okay? That is not history. I interviewed Professor Manuan Pim, who wrote 3 essays dealing with the fake Willie Lynch letter of 1712. Actually, he called it Death to the Willie Lynch letter. And I interviewed him, I did a number of interviews with him on different topics, but I interviewed him November 21st, 2013. And we have it on our YouTube channel also. And it deals with this history, okay? Dealing with the fake Willie Lynch letter 1712, breaking down why it's a fraud. I've done another broadcast since then also dealing with it as well. All right, so this is just a little bit of the history we deal with. So we'll post the link again. You can register for the online course. As soon as you register, you can start watching the bonus content, the content that we have there. And let's see here. How's everybody doing? So it is, it's $80. It's a 8-week, it's an 18-week, 16-hour online course. It may go a little past 16 hours. Just telling you all now, because I have a lot of information to cover. But it's all archived. So this class starts up Wednesday, June 12th, 2019, 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. If you miss any of it, we'll record all of it. You can go back and watch it over and over again. Watch from around the world. And it's a deep class. And then the subsequent classes should be on Saturdays, in general on Saturdays, okay, probably about 4 p.m. All right, Ancient Kemet, the Moors, and the Maafa, Understanding the Transatlantic Slave Trade, what they didn't teach in school, 2019 edition. So we posted the link there. It's also at our website, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. You can register there also. Okay. So look, hey, we're going to get out of here. Remember, at the African History Network, thanks for tuning in, everybody. Follow us on our YouTube channel, Michael Imhotep, IMHOTEP on YouTube. Follow us on our Facebook fan page, The African History Network, The African History Network. And remember, at the African History Network, we focus on educating, empowering, and inspiring people of African descent throughout the diaspora and around the world, because right now it's corrects wrong behavior. And let's see, I'll be in Atlanta for the Juneteenth celebration coming up June 14th through the 16th. We have the information at our website, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. If you want to donate to the African History Network, if you like this type of information, PayPal.me/the AHN show, PayPal.me/the AHN show. Also, we have all of my DVD lectures at our website, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. We have bundle packs there also. We have, let's see, what is this? The Black Panther 6 DVD bundle pack also. That's on sale, $50. You get 3 of my lectures dealing with the film Black Panther. Also, 3 other presentations, including The Light of Ancient Egypt Awakens the African Mind. Let's see here. I'll post that link there as well. Okay, remember, right now it's correct wrong behavior. It's not over till we win. Wakanda forever. We'll talk to you next time. Peace.